Dr. Alan Heisterkamp. We bless you, Alan, and may your wisdom be a blessing to us today.
Well, thank you, Sister Jennifer, for those kind remarks, and I need some tissue. Your comments were wonderful, and your presence at our convening, our training, which seems like a long time ago, was such a blessing to all of the students and the faculty and the other community partners who attended those 2 days together in Cedar Falls. So thank you for joining us those days, and thank you for your leadership and your commitment to, creating safer and healthier communities and homes and all of the above. So thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you all, and good morning. What an honor and a privilege it is to be with all of you here this morning and today on a Saturday. I was actually praying, at least in the Cedar Falls, Eastern Iowa area, for rain and miserable weather. So folks would feel like they weren't missing anything outside. And it's cloudy and chance of rain this morning. So, anyway, it's wonderful to be with you here. And yeah, we have a wonderful day. We had begun this conversation several months ago, and in a perfect world, in an ideal world that we all aspire, we would have spent 2 wonderful days together in each other's company and being able to, I heard someone share earlier, the opportunity to hug you. We would be in close proximity and enjoying each other's companionship and presence. And as the COVID gods would have it, we are here today on Zoom, and we will make the best of our time together. And I hope it is as productive and as relevant at the end of the day as has been planned in preparation for this. So thank you in advance for being here again and for your presence today. So we will begin. Shortly here, I'm going to be sharing my screen and walking us through some housekeeping and some introductory remarks to set the stage for what will be, as Sister Jennifer mentioned, an interactive, communicative workshop. The beauty of the work around prevention that I've had the privilege of doing in so many different communities and with so many different groups and organizations is that there is no one training quite like the other. Each is unique and different in its own way because, quite frankly, because of the unique participants who join in and participate and share and get engaged, if you will, with reflective thinking, but also the opportunity to share with others. And so I could tell when I first came on this morning that this group is probably not going to be bashful about sharing. I so much enjoyed listening to everybody greet everyone this morning and welcome each other, and from all over. I realized that this time together today goes beyond just the Midwest, beyond just the boundaries of our country, but to our guests from other lands. So welcome, Lisorani. We'll have an opportunity to introduce ourselves via the chat function here shortly. So with that, I want to dig right in and begin with some preliminary kind of background and housekeeping items, and we'll continue on through the day and have it be a powerful, wonderful day. Courageous Conversations is the title that we've been talking about, that we, in preparation for today, knowing that we at all junctures in our personal and professional lives have had conversations where we've had to muster up a certain amount of courage, or it took some courage to have a conversation with someone that we care about, that we know, that we love, that we work with. And there are always moments when we sometimes fail to have those, exact words, or the comforting narrative that we maybe want to have. And this training, this time today is hopefully going to be an opportunity for us to practice and rehearse some ways in which we can enter into these conversations so that they become a little less perhaps intimidating and more supportive and helpful, and that there's growth and peace for all the participants in the conversation. So, and as Sister Jennifer mentioned, the Mentors of Violence Prevention model that we have been using, that I've been using in Iowa and other parts of the country for 20 years now, what I have so much appreciated about the approach in this model is that it is very much based in the Socratic approach, and that is that the answers lie within us, and those who are assembled here today have so much wisdom and so many experiences to share that I think will be relevant to our growth together, and the community building process that is really the key and the essential elements to creating any primary prevention approach to challenging and confronting issues of bullying, harassment, any form of harm that can be committed from one to another. That the community has this amazing challenge, this amazing responsibility, but this amazing opportunity to really lift the veil and to make the invisible visible. And those opportunities to hear what others think and believe is such a powerful strategy and an important strategy, particularly in the world of being an active bystander, which we'll talk about later in terms of a friend, a colleague, a coworker, a family member. These are the conversations and the social arenas that we will be focusing on for quite a few of our examples today, and how to take and branch out from that information to make it relevant into other circles of influence that each of us have. So let's begin, shall we, on this journey together. You all were, Mary Therese, thank you very much for sending out those updates, and with the artifacts, the articles, along with the agenda. And so here is a sample of hopefully what you have already had a chance to glean. And what we try to do in all of our workshops is to have one activity, one discussion, one theme lead into the other, where we come to a culminating activity where we pull it all together and examine some of the things that we discussed, for example, this morning, and apply them into some real life situations here this afternoon, where I can't wait to, and excited to have you into small groups, looking together at a situation that perhaps could emerge in our respective communities, and to have a conversation with others to think through and walk through with some strategies and some guidelines. What is possible? What's possible in terms of how we can demonstrate and use our gifts and our talents and our skills, which is really a definition of how we lead and how we show up with each other, both in community and in our personal and other professional arenas. So as you can see here, we will walk through a discussion around leadership. I'm excited to share and to have you explore more deeply just a couple of the artifacts that we sent out earlier. These articles and artifacts are meant to be teasers, if you will, or opportunities for maybe some of you to explore more deeply some of the areas that these articles or these publications present. And I also think that they're, for all of us who work in some capacity with youth and families, that this information, that these artifacts that we talk about today, I think are incredibly valuable and helpful in the identities that I hold as father, husband, colleague, co-worker, educator. These articles I do find to be very helpful and informative in a very practical sense. And it really helps to have access to resources and to, I'm always appreciative of others sharing their resources with me. So these are gifts that we'll talk about and use today. And then we'll end this afternoon at the very end, convening in some time thinking about some next steps based on perhaps not just today's conversation, but other previous opportunities, other initiatives or meetings that are happening within the Presentation Sisters community. What might be some possible next steps? And we'll talk more about that as we go. So some housekeeping and some technical maneuvers, just to be mindful of knowing that certainly as these past 12 months have taught us, is that we have varying experiences and to navigate technology and think back at the things that we've all learned over the past 12 months. For those of us who maybe weren't as familiar with platforms like Zoom or FaceTime or whatever platform is your preference, we've all become maybe a little more tech savvy with regards to these platforms, which can be a blessing, but it can also become more and more challenging. The curiosity that we have about the technology and the opportunity to bring us all together here from multiple locations it's incredible when you think about it. So let's look at some of these examples here, and then I will pause and invite Mary Tracy to fill in any gaps that I may be missing as we kind of talk through this. So inviting all of you to keep your videos on to the extent that you can and that you feel comfortable, and I know we'll mute the audio unless you're sharing with the group. And to share with the group, you can unmute yourself. Another quick trick is to hold your space bar on your laptop or your computer, hold it down, and I believe that will allow you to speak, and then release it and you're back muted again. We will plan. I have a timer here. I know the fatigue of Zoom is a real thing, and I realize that today, sitting in front of a screen, it takes a lot of focus and concentration. It is my intent to every hour to step back and to take 5-10 minute break, to stand up, to move around, to have a chance to refocus. But I want to be really diligent about taking those important breaks along the way to keep us engaged, but also not exhausted at the end of the day. We will welcome your thoughts and ideas in the chat box throughout the workshop today, and we will have plenty of opportunities for you to provide some feedback, and all feedback is welcome. And we'll talk more about that later. There may be an opportunity today where we ask you to rename yourself in the little video clip as you appear on the screen. For the purposes of an activity, there's a strong likelihood that I'll invite you to replace your name with another word as it relates to the activity itself, and then to go back and to put your name back in as you have already done so. But that would be another technical maneuver that would ask you to participate today. There'll be times when we will invite you to break out into small groups, and we will do that regularly, which is another great way to kind of break up the day into chunks where you have a chance to interact, engage in small groups. And probably the groups will not be the same each time we break away. We will do those randomly, or if we happen to wanting to send you back into another configuration and it works out that it's the same number of groups that we desire, you may find yourself back into a room with a similar group before. But our intent is to allow you to mix it up, and so that you could get a chance to connect with several of your colleagues and friends here today. And then we'll introduce you to an app called Jamboard. Now, it's not jam like in my favorite strawberry jam, of course, but it is an application that will allow us to contribute collectively to a response where we really are practicing that Socratic model, that the answers do in fact lie within us, and our thoughts and perspectives when gathered together really allows us to, I think, create some wonderful working definitions and perspectives together that we can all learn and think critically about. And maybe even, as Sister Jennifer mentioned earlier, this idea of challenging our thinking, whether that's us challenging your own thinking, or maybe perhaps listening to what a colleague shares and how that may sit with you. And like many workshops of this nature, there can be maybe opportunities for comments or experiences to be shared, which could maybe to that person have been very traumatic. And we want to really allow time and space for individuals, if they feel comfortable, to share in small groups or etc., to do that, but to know that we want to create together a safe space. And we'll talk about some of those expectations on the next slide. Back to the technology piece, I would just pause for a moment and ask Mary Therese. Mary Therese, is there anything that we talked about previously that would be a really good point to make at this point in time that I've maybe overlooked?
If it's okay, I'm just going to do a real brief PowerPoint, just how to rename, where the chat is, just in case people aren't as familiar. So if that will work for you, Alan, we'll stop.
Sounds great.
Screen and I'll share mine. It's just we have really basic. Most people have been on Zoom, but I know some of these are new features, so we'll try and make this as simple as we can. So if you're on your phone, it's going to be a little bit different, but it should be similar, so that should help. So on the basic bottom, you're going to have your mute all the way to the left, and the video for stop and start video. It's a little video camera. So if we're asking you to mute or unmute, it's going to be the bottom left-hand corner. It looks like a microphone. And the video will be the same thing. If you're having trouble with your video turning on and off, go to the next one over. It looks like a video cam. It'll say start or stop video. Those would be the key. For participants here, you'll see at the bottom, you can see how many people are here. I think it's 61 right now. If you click on it, it will show up a whole list of people who are here. So if you want to look for someone's name, that might be a faster way than looking through everyone's picture. The other thing is we might ask you to raise your hand. You can physically raise your hand and wave. That works really well if this doesn't work. Or when you click participants at the bottom, it will come up on the side. You'll see your name and it will say you can unmute me or you can say raise hand. That's what we're going for. Or at the bottom, there'll also be a reactions tab. And there will be an option to raise hand. If all else fails, just wave your hands in the air and we'll find you that way too. So don't get too stressed out about raising your hand. This is the big one about renaming that we're going to try today. So if you can or cannot, we'll try and do this together. But again, at the participants at the bottom, you're going to find, if you click it, it will come up with a list of people. And this is if you're on a computer. You'll have this option, we'll say right here with this more, and then we'll say rename will pop up or add a profile picture. The other option, if you're trying to rename, and we could show this slide when Alan asks us to do this later, is in the corner of your picture, there's going to be these 3 little dots. When you click on the 3 little dots, you'll have these options underneath. And you're going to hit rename, and you can rename yourself. So these are all different ways to change your name on the screen. We will show this again if people are having trouble with it. So just really a simple way, the 3 dots at the corner of your picture and click rename, or in the participants tag, find your name, click more, rename. Again, at the bottom is the chat feature. I think most people have figured out kind of how to use this. You can choose to message everyone, or you can choose someone's name here if you'd like. So When he asks you to introduce yourself, it's going to go to everyone automatically. So everyone will see what you write. So just to let you know, so don't write anything secret messages to someone. If you have it to everyone, everyone will see your message to everyone else. And then lastly, we have the different types of view. So in the top right-hand corner, you're probably, it's either going to say speaker view or gallery view. So gallery is when you see all these people. And this is the speaker view. So in the corner, you could see this will show you the option to change the speaker view. And this tells you to change the gallery view. So those are the two different views. So as we're sharing screens and different things, it might be helpful if you want to see the whole group or you just like to see the presenter. We'll try and have the presenter spotlighted for you. And if you want to see the pictures of everyone, there's a little arrow in the corner of your screen. You should be able to see that in gallery view. You can look at everyone's lovely picture and see how awake they are. And lastly, when we're giving a presentation like today, there should be a bar in the middle. You'll see participants on one side or just the speaker and the PowerPoint on the other side. So you can move that black bar in the middle, left or right, and it will make the presentation smaller and see more people or vice versa. So that's another way to change that screen there. And so if you have any questions, feel free to message in the chat. Jesse is also helping, or Alan will be helping, but anytime you have any questions, you just let us know. So back to Alan.
Thank you so much, Bridget. That was wonderful. I will go back and share my screen, and I would just reiterate, please insert questions into the chat if you are unable to access any of the things of which we're referring to during today's time together, and we will work it out. We will make sure that the individuals have what they need to have. So thank you for that. Let's continue on then. So as like with many group walking into a session like today, with those, some of you know each other very well, and some of you maybe not very well. And by the end of today, I hope that we have been able to look and have our time together be a safe and supportive environment, which I have no doubt will be the case. These are some suggestions that group agreements have been assembled or been created from other participants in the past, and I'm just going to share with you some, and then I'm going to pause and I'm going to invite individuals to, in the chat box here, we'll get a chance to practice what Mary Therese just shared with us. If there's anything that you have found to be helpful for any of your previous meetings or group sessions together that's not listed here, we would welcome those in the chat as well. And we will be, while this is being recorded, recording the chat feature also provides just a really beautiful and wonderful archive of comments, commentary, questions, thinking out loud, examples, etc., that we'll share throughout the day. So again, what you share in the chat box will become an archive and a part of today's workshop and time together. So listen actively, being respectful to the views of others, helping create safe space to share feelings and thoughts, being respectful of others' experiences, commitment to empathy, share voluntarily, of course, participate in discussions as much as possible. And those again are just a few. I'm just going to pause for a moment, and if there are other group agreements that you have appreciated in the past, please insert those in the chat box at this time. All right. If you are typing, please continue to do so. Otherwise, we're going to go on, and we will be inviting everyone to share in the chat box some information about themselves. And I see that we have a couple of comments coming in to the chat box now as we speak, and I just want to pause for a moment to make sure that we are acknowledging those. Hang on one second. And yes, use I statements. Thank you, Janet. Speaking from our own experiences, using I statements when possible. Thank you for sharing those. At the beginning of a small group, take a second or two to just look into the eyes of each other. Thank you. And then questions about the renaming piece. when we get to that activity, we'll pause and Mary Therese and or I will again walk and explain what that looks like. And it's a one-step process, but we will be able to coach everyone through that. And Anne-Marie writes, rename as what? The activity itself will invite you to display a word that describes what you think or believe about a certain statement, whether you agree with that statement, whether you disagree with that statement, or whether you're unsure. And at that point in time, we'll invite participants to replace their name with either the word agree, the word unsure, or the word disagree. So more on that later, but thank you for asking. Confidentiality. Thank you, Lorraine. Confidentiality. Yes. All right. So on your screen should show the instructions for us. I'm inviting each of you to take this time right now and in the chat box, if you could type in your name, your order or the organization with whom you represent, your location, why are you interested in this training, or what is interesting to you about this training. And I would invite you to type in a word that you would use for leadership. What's a word that you would use for leadership? And I'll pause just a moment here and allow you some time to type in the chat box. So thank you. And welcome. If you have just been able to join us just recently, on the screen, you hopefully will see the slide titled, please introduce yourself. In the chat box, go ahead and type in your name, your order, your organization, your location, a short statement as to what interests you about this training and your word for leadership. And we'll just pause just another minute or two and allow participants to type in their response. So thank you for that. Thank you, everyone. As you continue to type, I'll just allow another minute for those of you to type in your response, but thank you. These are wonderful, and I hope that all of you get a chance to pull up the chat box as it appears on your screen, and you can scroll through and read what others are writing about their interest for the day, and also the word for leadership. And in a moment, I'll highlight a few, and as we go through those together. So thank you. Take about one more minute. Thank you. All right, and we're back. And if you just joined us, we are just now typing into the chat box, introducing ourselves, name, our organization, our location, a comment about why we're interested in this training, and then a word that you would use or substitute the word leadership. So thank you, everyone, for your contributions. And just looking real briefly, as you scroll through the chat box to read the comments, really wanting to learn ways, Carol writes, to integrate ways of interrupting violence, bullying, and racism. And the word for leadership is service. So thank you for sharing that. Anne-Marie, there's a number of reasons why. Helping young people in the area, living in the inner city of Dublin and the IPA directions, if you will, states we practice nonviolence of mind and heart as we listen unto the chaos and feel the pain of our time. Thank you for sharing, and thank you, Anne-Marie, for being with us today from Dublin. Therese writes, from Dubuque, nonviolent techniques and conversations, being able to empower others. Robert writes, because violence there's so much violence to diffuse. There's so many opportunities for us to engage in community building and being signs of hope and support for those who maybe find themselves on the receiving end of harm and abuse. Rita, thank you for sharing your word for leadership, facilitating the power and the ability of others. Thank you for sharing that. Jean Mayer, the words for leadership, encouragement. Thank Thank you very much, and thank you for being with us today. And just a couple more as you skim through and look. Being respectful, being a positive model. Linda writes, again, service, the word empowering has come up several times. Diane, thank you. Collaborative, as you shared. So wonderful, thank you. And so enjoy looking at some of the comments that have been shared with us. Let's continue on. And the next statement I would like you to think about for a moment is a quote that's attributed to Mark Twain. And being involved in education for the last 37, 38 years, this statement has always struck me since the time I read it, or was it brought to my attention. Education consists mainly of what we unlearn. As Mark Twain would say, education consists mainly of what we unlearn. And so my question for you is, when it comes to preventing violence and abuse, what might Mark Twain be inviting us to unlearn? And I'd like you to think to that for a moment. And Mary Therese, here's the moment of reckoning. I'm going to invite us to, Mary Therese, I would like to do this in like pairs or at most in groups of 3. And so based on dividing up into pairs, and there may be one group of 3, I'm not sure, but I would love for the participants to grab a partner. And if you haven't yet met this person, introduce yourself to them. And then if you would mind sharing with each other for just a few minutes here, not very long, but when it comes to preventing violence and abuse, what might Mark Twain be asking us to unlearn? So I'm going to invite you to go to a breakout room. Mary Therese will be setting that up. You'll get an invitation on your desk, on your screen, to go to a certain room. Just click on yes, or click to that room, and off you'll go, where you'll meet a pair of bright, a smiling face, and we'll give you a few minutes just to have a conversation about this quote. Education consists mainly of what we unlearn. Here, I'll just show that one more time for all of you. Education consists mainly of what we unlearn. Mark Twain be inviting us to unlearn. We will call you back by a command, and you will naturally come back and populate back into the larger group. And we'll send a message and alert the breakout sessions to end. So, Mary Therese, am I missing anything?
Nope. Just give me one more minute just to make sure that we have all the groups ready to go, but 5 minutes, correct?
Yeah, actually, let's do it. Let's do 4, because I know there's a 60-minute timer, I think, default. So at 4 minutes, we can have them begin to start to wind down. Thank you.
All right. Enjoy your conversations.
All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. I think we have folks returning from the breakout session. So thank you in advance. And what I'd like to do is to take just, and we'll, again, being cognizant of the time, our time together, and I would love to make sure as I mentioned before, the chat box really provides this wonderful archive of thought and perspective. And so if you would take 60 seconds and in the chat box, could you put into 2 or 3 words or a short phrase what you think Mark Twain might be inviting you or us to unlearn as it relates to preventing violence and abuse? Take just 60 seconds in the chat box and we'll continue on. So thank you. And thank you, and just appreciate your candid, honest comments. Joy, not to put my thinking on the other person. Carol writes, unlearn my unconscious bias. That was my comment too, Carol, just not even realizing the ones I had I was paired with Janet from Chicago and just shared being in education for 30 some years. You know, the students that I work with taught me so much about who I was. And maybe some of you have had those similar experiences as well. Fear of not knowing how to intervene. Yes, absolutely. Unlearn the self-protection strategies that we learn, such as staying silent until conflict goes away. The silence is very common, and we all are challenged oftentimes by that. So thanks for sharing that. The prejudices we inhaled from childhood. We'll talk about the childhood experiences later this morning. So thank you, Isabel, for responding to that or sharing that. Unlearning dualistic thinking. Thank you. And Julia writes, there's more than one way to be or to do. Absolutely. No one has created it better than any other person. Yes. And women are to be quiet and respectful. Thank you, Elena. And unlearning some of the things around gender. We'll talk about some of the gender violence and how does gender disrespect show up in our communities, in both our personal and our private or public worlds. Negative thinking, Suzanne writes, speaking judgments, learning self-care. Thank you for sharing that as well. Wonderful. Thank you very much for contributing to that. And again, feel free to go back and look at the chat box, but this again is such a wonderful archive to have. One of the, based on that last comment that was shared with regards to self-care, one of the pieces of information that I don't think I said verbally, but I think could have been definitely written in a previous chat box, was that when we are in the midst of conversations or having a conversation today or walking through an example, and if it becomes a bit too much for you at that point in time, based on the content, absolutely feel free to mute yourself. You can turn off your video, take a break, practice self-care, be aware of how your body is responding, your feelings, your thinking around things, and please monitor that yourself. And if you, again, and if you desire or want to visit or chat with one of the team members that helped organize today's session, you can chat with them or text them privately, and if you need to visit or talk. So anyway, thank you for that reminder in the chat box just now. But self-care and self-help. Let's go on here now. So the thing with the unlearning piece, at least in my experiences, has been this: how close do I walk up to the face of vulnerability and the face of uncertainty, and see that as an opportunity of growth for me, as opposed to repelling and staying away from that and never challenging myself. And you know, we talk about, you probably have heard about the adopting a growth model in maybe in a collegial sense, or in your work, maybe in your relationships. And basically, this is what Mark Twain is getting at, I think, unlearning and relearning things as we do, right, in our everyday lives. And most of us see ourselves as active, lifelong learners. And so we're always in this cycle of this unlearning, which oftentimes can be, like I mentioned earlier, very a discomfort or vulnerable in our feelings. But we work through those. We begin to hold ourselves based on some of our maybe new thinking or different perspective. And so our accountability changes, our relationships with self and others begins to change as well. And we sense this feeling of growth and accomplishment, and it feels good. And we're thankful for that. We appreciate those moments when we feel like we've, been a part of something positive. And it never fails, as life would have it, that there will be other opportunities and other interactions with others in our public, in our private lives, where this sense of discomfort or being challenged or something about how we have operated or what we have believed has become maybe not as readily adopted or supported by others. And we get this comfort again. So then we go back into the reflection mode, and anyway, I think it's just helpful to be mindful of the fact that this is a very natural part of what we do and how we navigate in and out of our relationships, this cycle and unlearning. And I love how Mark Twain, I think Mark helps us to imagine or see this as a natural part of the progression of how we function and operate. And so it's important to kind of walk into that vulnerability, to walk into that uncertainty, knowing that it can be sometimes scary and certainly uncomfortable. And so a question that I have for us here this morning, and this will take us to the break, our first break today. So the question that I would like, it should be question singular, not plural. In a small group, I'm going to invite each of you to, if you choose, to voluntarily share what makes you feel vulnerable or uncertain about this current time in history. What makes you feel vulnerable or uncertain about this current time in history? And what I'm going to invite you to do in small groups, and Mary Therese, let's do groups of 5, so roughly 12 groups. Does that make sense? So we'll invite you to join one of 12 groups, and we're going to provide 15 minutes. At the end of 15 minutes, we're going to start the clock and we'll take a 10-minute break. And so we will then convene back here into the larger group in roughly 25 minutes. All right, so 15 together for your group, short discussion, and then we'll do 10 minutes for the break. And we'll convene back here. My clock says about 9:30, so about 9:50, we'll look to convene back together in a large group. All right, so your task, what makes you feel vulnerable or uncertain about during these current times, in this current time in history. I'll stop sharing, and again, in advance, Mary Therese, thank you for your help with the small groups.
I've just invited everyone to unmute themselves and you'll go to your rooms. Now, again, if there's any questions at the bottom, there's always an ask for help button at the bottom.
Many of you also enjoy a daily dose of the Center for Action and Contemplation. I was introduced to Father Richard Rohr's work a few years ago and really enjoy the work that the Center for Action and Contemplation have been providing. And just, again, being a lifelong learner, I think our last conversation that we had in small groups reminded me of March 31st article in the Daily Contemplation from Breaking the Cycle of Violence. And in the narrative of that particular day was a writing from Felicia Murrell, who's listed here, a writer and editor and friend of the Center for Action and Contemplation, and shares some of her own desires to walk a new and courageous path as an African-American woman. And she writes, "And there in liminal space, the space of sitting with our truths, the place of mystery, the unknown, the place where we let go of our injured expectations to be seen, to be known, to be welcomed. We offer ourselves what we've longed to have given to us. We acknowledge our feelings, the power and the depth of each one, giving them space to roll through us, to breathe and take on life." So as we think about the work that lies ahead in our communities, our families, our closest friends and our closest allies, and those with whom we differ and whom we disagree, and those feelings of unsettledness and uncertainty and vulnerability, we can rest assured that there are there's growing communities and growing conversation and dialogue that this today is an extension of, and has begun and will continue to grow to create those our spaces, our liminal spaces for us to sit in and hear what it has to share and what it has to teach us as we navigate together through some of our challenges that we are facing in our country and certainly around the world today. So thank you for your thinking and your sharing. And let's move on here. So we have leadership. Thank you for your words associated with leadership. And when we talk about prevention and we talk about really creating those courageous conversations with ourselves and each other, it really is a form of leadership. And we think about all the different ways in which leaders can lead. And there is the beautiful part about leadership is there's no one right way to be a leader, and leadership can show up in many different ways, but it's always the same question is so who can do this? Who can lead, right? Who can do this? And the short answer to that is that all of us are asked and are called to be leaders. All of us as friends, in my work in education, and others as co-workers, as family members, or as a member of a community, like many of you or most of you, that we are called and can lead and to be that strong, courageous person at time. But we can't do it by ourselves. And we don't always feel strong and courageous 100% of the time, which is wonderful to have a community where that leadership can exchange and ebb and flow and shared and practiced together. When I'm feeling at my most vulnerable or my own weak sense of weakness, it never fails that there is someone or some group that seems to be able to help pull me along and move me along with them as we try to tackle some of the inequality and the different ways in which harm and abuse show up in our communities, in our work settings, within our families, that we can be courageous together, but nobody has to be courageous and lead all the time, that we can share and share the load. And we do this talking about, really explicitly talking about what does it mean to be a bystander, and why do we focus on this idea, this strategy, if you will, about being an active bystander, which is not a new concept. It has been around for several decades now, and much has been written and discussed and talked about. The notion of those who see, those who witness, right? I mean, really, in your church teaching, there have been bystanders that are explicitly described in scripture and in literature about seeing and witnessing and understanding what's going on, and then deciding to themselves, what do I do with this? How should I show up in those times of uncertainty, those times of vulnerability, those times when we see those injustices happening? What do we do in those moments? And so that's been a part of kind of the broader discussion in our work with regards to this MVP, or Mentors of Violence Prevention model. And it really boils down to, when we pull all of the data, all the research together about what we mean by this bystander, this person who witnesses, who observes, in the context of, as I mentioned earlier, being in the context of our friendship circles, our spheres of influence, our co-workers, our colleagues, those with whom we know and navigate, that really what we do is we pay attention. So there will be times in our journey, in our interactions with others, in our work settings, in our public settings, where we observe things we notice. We may oftentimes find situations where behaviors are problematic, and we have this discernment in terms of, is this potentially harmful? Is this potentially, headed in a really negative or uncertain pattern of behavior. And then comes the question that everyone in that situation asks themselves is, do I have a responsibility to respond? Do I have a responsibility to do something, right? We ask ourselves this question, and we can think of examples of how this plays out. In some environments, in some organizations, there are certain individuals with titles and with job descriptions, which almost in some cases demands that they be this active bystander, that they actually step in or respond in a way to de-escalate or to maybe divert or to redirect or to calm the waters, if you will. And that's all well and good in that organizational and that structural setting. Some families that you may have grown up in, or some families that we may be working with, that there may be a very, very explicit and defined structure that problems are solved by this person in this family, or issues around challenging and confronting those behaviors or social norms that might support harm and abuse are dealt with by this person in the organization or this head of household, etc. All of those things are possible. But what we're really getting at here is going back to the idea of leadership, is that we can all exercise and demonstrate ways in which to lead, which many of you responded to in the chat box earlier: empowering, being a role model, service, encouragement, all of those wonderful words that describe different types of leaders. Just as there's no one right way to be a leader, there's no one right way to be an active bystander, because it becomes very personal. And the extent to which I might act or respond in a helpful sort of way is going to be contingent on my sense of safety, perhaps the extent to which I'm familiar with either party or both parties that may be in conflict, or where there may be some behaviors that are perceived by me as being potentially challenging. So what this slide really trying to represent is that we all find ourselves at some place in time in these various stages as a person who witnesses, who observes, who sees, in the context of our areas with individuals with whom we know, whom we're familiar, as I mentioned before several times, family members, co-workers, etc. So noticing, interpreting as a problem potentially, asking myself or ourselves, to what extent are we responsible? What makes that my responsibility? And then if we have some ideas and thoughts about how we can insert ourselves in a helpful, supportive way, then I'm more likely to do that. And what we'll do this afternoon is we'll look explicitly at some very detailed examples of what that might look like. And again, understanding that we're talking broadly here in terms of exercising our own individual skills and leadership. This is how we will show up. It gives us some insight as to how we will show up in those situations. We will be ourselves. We will respond in ways in which that are natural and meaningful to us, given our unique skill set, our unique sense of relationship building, our unique sense of and strategy and kind of thoughtful response. We know that in this work around prevention that there are all kinds of pressures to be silenced. And that was a theme that came up in our small group, and it was also shared in the chat box as well. This idea, I think Mark Twain inviting us to, really see some of the challenges of being silent and how being silent can miscommunicate our intentions or miscommunicate what it is that we actually believe. And it becomes unknown, or people aren't sure how individuals might think or believe a situation, because we haven't been able to share or haven't felt comfortable sharing that. So we know that there are some really barriers that are out there, and it's important to recognize those, but to not dwell on those as inhibitors, but to be able to recognize those so that we can intentionally perhaps seek out guidance, some help, support from others as I mentioned earlier, when sometimes in our, wanting to be a leader and engaged and involved, there are sometimes when we don't feel like we're, we're ready for that, or we're not in the, able to be that person that we would really want to be in the situation, and having the community around us to, help demonstrate and to shoulder, if you will, the some of the leadership responsibilities is a wonderful strategy to have, and it's a very natural, normal process. So looking at these barriers, for example, just collecting a summary, if you will, of what the research is there, that the social influence, those social influences that can keep us silent for a variety of reasons are real, and we should acknowledge those, and we should understand that that's there and that's real, and it has a explicit impact on our ability and our comfortability in terms of responding. Fear of embarrassment is another one, or retaliation, which continues to be a growing concern at all levels. Whether you work with youth or work with middle-aged or with the elderly, we know that in all of those age groups at the entire lifespan, we don't want to do the wrong thing. We don't want to put ourselves in situations that our safety is compromised. That in itself can be a barrier, particularly in communities where there's a lot going on, a lot of interactions. I'm thinking of like schools or workplaces where there's a lot of conversation, give and take. Those are really, unfortunately, those are entities that really create a lot of conversation and can be really intimidating, especially if you're the person in that environment who sees and observes something that you recognize as being problematic, but you're not quite sure that you have the safety to say something, or that you have that those around you are thinking in a similar way that will help shoulder some of the responsibility. And that may be what we'll learn later on, that is a wonderful strategy in terms of being that active bystander, that good friend or good coworker, is that we have a team together that is working together, and we share the load of leadership, we share the load of responsibilities. It's a beautiful strategy, and one that resonates with a lot of individuals. The idea of pluralistic ignorance is basically in a nutshell, not being aware of or understanding how other people think and believe, and thinking that I'm the only one who might be concerned about this. And because I'm unsure how others think and believe, I might be ignorant, or maybe I'm not aware of they're thinking the same thing I am, but we haven't been able to verbally communicate that out loud yet, so that we know what each other's thinking. Now, in communities like the Sisters of the Presentation, you have a chance to, when you look at the climate and culture of your organization, while many of you would say it's not perfect, but many of you would also have to agree that you have outlets and opportunities to raise issues and to share moments where you may have been misunderstood, or things may appear to not be as they are, and there's opportunities and processes in place for those differences and those moments to come to the surface. That's the beautiful part of the bystander approach in terms of prevention, is that the more we discuss and talk about the behaviors that we see as being wrong, harmful, abusive, the more understanding I know, that the more likely I am to feel comfortable and confident in my leadership abilities and my leadership capacity to respond in a way that's comfortable for me, but gives me courage. It gives me strength and support. And then finally, the diffusion of responsibility. We sometimes allow people by their title and by their position to be the person who is responsible for addressing a situation, when in fact, we can all find opportunities to do that ourselves. So it's important to know these barriers, and then to be thinking strategically about, okay, so how does the process of engaging in the bystander approach help minimize or help challenge these barriers, which is what we will experience and throughout the day. So speaking of that, we have, we sent out, you were invited to look at an article called "What Differences Do Bystanders Make?" Right? The question. And so on page 98 through 101, there's the discussion part of that article. And what I would like for us to do is to, Mary Therese, with your help, I would like to probably in groups of, I would say 5 again, roughly 5 individuals. So if that's 12 or 11 groups, somewhere around there. But I would like you to have a brief discussion about those. And if you haven't been able to read that article yet, if you just go right, if you're able to pull it up, and Mary Therese, I'm wondering here too, the article, I know you sent Mary Therese the article, so maybe they want to refer to your email from yesterday or this morning. Would that be helpful? And yeah, awesome. So in that, so what difference do bystanders make? We're going to give you 15 minutes. And if you would focus on, again, the discussion part of that article, what stood out for you, what stands out for you, what catches your eye, what's your takeaway, are all ways in which to describe that. Just conversation and focus on those particular pages, and then we'll call you back in 15 minutes. So maybe take this time to maybe locate or identify that article that Mary Therese sent earlier. And you can pull that up on your computer, your laptop. And thank you in advance for your sharing and thinking about this.
Here is a copy of it. I'll just put it in the chat if you want to pull it up. You should be able to have access to it. And I'm going to unmute everyone. And you're going to your rooms. Thanks for your patience, everyone.
All right, well, welcome back, everyone. And let me start off this next piece here by saying my apologies. I neglected to forward to Mary Therese the copy of the document, the article that I referenced. What differences do bystanders make? You will have that copy. You will have access to that article. But being that we had the article in front of us, the Bystander, Anti-Racism, a review of the literature, if you will, you notice these particular sections of the article itself. What I would like to do right now is to have you quickly reflect on some of the conversation that you just had and share a thought or something that stood out for you from perhaps maybe something that you shared about this article or that someone else shared. And if you would just a moment and think about that, and then when you're ready, if you would be so inclined to type that in the chat box as a way to reflect openly about what stood out for you. We'll give you 2 minutes, so think to yourself, what was an interesting piece or something that stood out, and then type it in the chat box, and we'll check in 2 minutes. All right, thank you. All right, and thank you for, as you continue to type, and again, looking at the chat and having each of you take a look at some of the information that is being shared by your colleagues here. Thank you for sharing those. Bridget writes, one person with a few words can de-escalate conflict. Thank you. Anne-Marie, normally I remain silent and do not act, and that's very, very common, and we've all done that before, so thank you for sharing that. I can be encouraged to speak because of the support of others. Thank you, Marilyn, for sharing that. The challenges, as Suzanne writes, of being an active bystander, the advantage of support of the community and one another. Thank you. And Rita writes, even in small actions can be important, and I need to not talk myself out of something because it seems like such a small action when in fact sometimes those are the most profound ways or helpful sorts of ways. Sister Pat writes, at times silence occurs when I'm collecting my thoughts and wondering, is anyone else feeling like I do? Absolutely. Thank you, Sister Pat, for sharing that. Carmen writes, we need to speak our truth and do it in a nonviolent way. Thank you, Carmen. And Janet writes, actively entering the situation takes courage, but can make a huge difference in stopping a violence, the violence, for example. The girl who videotaped George Floyd's death didn't stop his death, but woke up the world to police brutality. Thank you, Janet. Different ways in which we can show up, safe ways, but meaningful ways. And it can look different from each of us. Janet Ryan writes, the value of the courage to confront with compassion. Wonderful. And Julia writes, with support from some other bystanders, gives the courage to risk speaking up or speaking and acting. Exactly. Many times after the fact, I think, oh, why didn't I think about that? Or say that in the midst of the highly intensive conversation. Julia, you are absolutely correct, and the ways in which we respond sometimes may not be at the moment, but when we've collected our thoughts and have thought and tensions have declined a little bit, we're much more free in our thinking sometimes after the fact. So, well, thank you everyone here too. Carol writes, bystander anti-racism can make a difference in changing how our culture and society deals with racism. Thank you. And Isabella Rafferty, think of the importance of the bystander witnessing the murder of George Floyd. Again, how we can show up in multiple ways. There are many ways to lead. There are many ways to be that good friend, that neighbor, that coworker, that family member. There are many ways that we can, when we do witness and see and observe things that we can begin to see ourselves saying or doing maybe differently. And we'll practice some of those things explicitly. So yes, thank you for your sharing of those. Let's continue on here, and let's go. The MVP, the Mentors of Violence Prevention model, actually was created and was established to really focus on different types of bullying and gender-based violence behaviors, primarily in school age, young adults, military, any business organization, etc. But it's had a really strong focus on looking at the ways in which gender violence shows up in our communities, in society as a whole. And a very simplistic way of describing a very complex behavior, when we think about gender violence, we think about violence on a continuum, if you will, with regards to on the left-hand side, if you look, at the y-axis, thinking about different types of harm and abuse. At the top, you see where it says sexual and physical. On the bottom, you see where it says verbal, emotional. What gender violence in essence is describing, and there are many different types of violence, but when we talk about gender-based violence, in the literature and in the research for decades, gender violence was oftentimes attributed to men's violence against women. Men's violence against women physically, emotionally, sexually. It's one of the, I would say, the World Health Organization or the United Nations organization itself would talk about gender violence in terms of men's violence against women, which is a serious and is frequent and is something. It's a pandemic across the entire globe, right? Now, in saying that, well, we understand that the vast majority of men in society and in the world are not violent, but most of the types of violence that's attributed to domestic violence or sexual violence is 85 to 90% perpetrated by those who identify as male. We know that statistically happens, and disproportionately those types of abuse are impacted by those who identify as more feminine or as female. Today, I would say that when we talk about gender-based violence, we also talk about in terms of gender, violence against those who identify as LGBTQ, those who identify outside or in a non-binary sort of way with regards to male and female. And so we know statistically, especially our work especially in schools and in the K through 12 arena, youngsters who identify as LGBTQ or as questioning are at more risk and experience forms of bullying and harassment at higher rates than their peers who don't identify as LGBTQ, right? Now it's always interesting to talk about some of these phenomena because there are, again, this is on a continuum, and there are always exceptions to when we talk about violence and those who perpetrate versus those who are targeted or who are victims. It can vary, right? We know that women can be physically and sexually abusive. We know that can happen. We know that men can be victims of, or young men can be victims of physical or sexual abuse perpetrated by either other men or other women. We know those to be true. So when we talk about gender violence, we have to be able to hold multiple truths at the same time. And I think sometimes in this work around gender-based violence, it's easy for a critic to say, well, you're just beating up on men, or you're just male bashing, when in fact, the reality is that men stand so much to gain by really, confronting and addressing men's violence against other men, men's violence against women, men's violence against children, etc. We, as a society, we benefit from having men in this discussion. Again, most men aren't violent, but yet at the same time, another truth is that most men don't challenge other men, or most men are silent in their confronting or challenging behaviors perpetrated by others who identify as male. We know that to be a phenomenon that happens, and that's not unique to any one country or any one particular subset of the population. That is global. And so we have this opportunity when we talk about gender-based violence to really look at challenging, why is it in our society? Why do those who identify as in terms of the gender expression and in terms of social construction around what gender means in our society, why are those who identify more on the feminine or the female continuum of gender more susceptible or more inclined, disproportionately impacted? And when we're in our trainings and having these conversations, if there's any doubt with regard to sexual violence that's perpetrated against women and or girls, we only have to ask a couple questions. One, what do many women and girls do on a daily basis to protect themselves from being sexually harmed or sexually assaulted? And we create just a litany of examples of patterns of behavior, of mindful thinking around safety, about when women and girls navigate in our neighborhoods, in our society, in our communities, what they do instinctively, but what they've been taught to do to protect themselves from being assaulted. Conversely, when we ask young men and boys, what do they do on a daily basis to prevent themselves from being sexually assaulted, it's quite a different question to them. It's oftentimes it's not one that they have even thought much about. Again, not diminishing or ignoring the fact that some young boys and young men have been and are sexually harmed and abused. Absolutely can take place, but we know disproportionately it falls on to those who identify as women. So how does gender inequality, which really is kind of the subtext, if you will, of what supports some of this, different forms of harm and abuse based on gender. When we think about in our society or in our community and homes, how does gender inequality show up? again, which is foundational to some of the more overt acts of harm and abuse that individuals can experience, women and girls can experience. So we think about in society, think about the different ways this shows up in terms of just wages, or the conversation and the demand for equal pay for equal work. Think of the political and legislative folks. Think about the percent of women. I think roughly 25-30% at most, maybe, women in legislative positions, elected positions. We've seen an uptick, and we've seen increased numbers of women run for political office, and we know that is an important area if we want to really continue to work towards gender equality and gender equity. We need representation from all groups, but based on gender, based on race, etc. Economic resources, who has access to dollars, who holds the wealth in communities, who holds the wealth in our countries respectively, access to education. We may take that for granted here in the States, but yet I can point out some significant inequalities, more oftentimes based on race and socioeconomic status. But think about our colleagues and our co-workers in parts of the world where access to education is limited for women and girls, etc. Health services, human trafficking, while it can impact any identity, we know that women and girls and children are impacted more in human and sex trafficking. And then looking at more closer to our homes, in our respective communities, we think of just the domestic chores of a house, the household functioning, whose shoulders, whose responsibility do those chores land on most in homes traditionally? How is that changing? How do we still need to do more work? Intimate partner violence. When we look at domestic violence, and 90% of the incidences of domestic violence are perpetrated by men. We know that to be true. We know that that's a very hard and fast statistic that we have work to do, and it's a men's issue. And so women oftentimes are proportionally the targets of those. And at the same time, there is another truth that some men are abused and harmed by their female partners. That is true, absolutely. Decision-making processes at home, who has the final word? Just the incidences of harassment or sexual harassment. We know that certainly can happen in different configurations. We know predominantly women and girls are on the receiving end of sexual harassment disproportionately to their male counterparts. Childcare responsibilities. If anything, that COVID has helped us really begin to uncover and to demonstrate, in addition to access to technology and access to the internet, is about the impact that COVID has had on the service industry in our country and those who are most impacted by that, particularly persons of color and also those who identify as women or as female. So we know, and then the responsibility of childcare with schools shutting down, doing more remote, the stress, the extra responsibilities that has placed on households. And we've seen an uptick in different forms of domestic violence, unfortunately. And so our colleagues in the field who are, responding to hotlines or who are operating and managing shelters, women and children's shelters, they've seen increases in not just phone calls and requests for help and support, but also women and children trying to find safe places in which to live. So anyway, this is kind of how it shows up, and it's systemic in nature, and it's not just one area. It's a societal concern, which brings us to this really, I feel it's one of the best summaries of the adverse childhood experiences reports that we've seen in a long time. And the adverse childhood experiences, from what we know and understand, is it's the impact that youngsters have had growing up. And they've identified 10 areas of concern, and having as you'll get a chance to talk about here in just a moment, the impact of those adult decisions on the youngsters as children, and then following those youngsters over the course of 2 or 3 decades. What's some of the impact? What are some of the adverse childhood experiences that they experience? And now, 20, 30 years later, 40 years later, what's that look like and sound like? It's an amazing study that was done. So what I'm going to do now, hopefully, and we have, I think you have access to this article, and I was able to make sure that I was on the ball. We're going to invite you to be one of 6 groups. And I'm going to, one of us here, Mary or myself, Mary Therese, if we could copy and paste, I think I have to, do I have to stop sharing? If I do that, let me get some instructions here first, and then we can copy and paste these into the chat box. So we're gonna send you randomly into one of 6 groups. Group number 1, on the Adverse Childhood Experiences article, I want you to look at the section entitled, What are ACEs? Which is on page 7. Group number 2, prevalence of ACEs. There's information there that starts on page 8. Group number 3, ACEs and health, which consists of pages 10 and 11. Group number 4, you'll have ACEs and mental health, which is on page 12 and 13. Group 5, what contributes to ACEs, 14 and 15. And then finally, group 6, collective trauma and racism as trauma. And we'll invite you in those 6 groups to have a chat, talk about your specific section. And we're going to do things just look, when you return, here's the slightly different one. What I would invite you to do is in your groups, when you first meet up in your one of 6 groups, could one of you volunteer to be a note taker, take a few notes, capture a few main thoughts? Could someone in your group then volunteer to be a reporter? And then when we come back, I'm going to invite each of the 6 reporters just to share verbally some feedback and kind of a brief summary, if you will, kind of like the headlines of your conversation. We'll give each group a couple minutes for the reporter to share back to all of us. So we'll get to actually hear other voices besides my own for this next kind of summary, if you will. So any questions about those instructions? So we'll give you about 15 minutes to chat. And I'm coming up on the hour. Here we go. Mary Therese, I know that you're looking at those rooms right at this minute as well, but we are due for a break. So let's combine this conversation, this 15-minute conversation, with the next break for 10 minutes. So let's convene back here as a large group in, let's say, 25 minutes. So that's 11, that'd be 11:20 my time. So 15 minutes in your group. We'll do this will be a wonderful jigsaw activity for this article for us to learn from each other. Sharing your thoughts and your reflections in small groups, and helping kind of divide up some of the group dynamics. And so we're excited. I'm excited to hear just a quick 2-minute soundbite from each of the group reporters. So let's do this. Let's start. Well, before we get started, so there's 2 things I wanted to do before we break for lunch. And Mary Therese, this might be a good time for us just to be clear about the lunch time. I'm not sure how explicit we were earlier, but our thoughts were we would complete our morning session as close to noon as possible, and then take, am I saying that right, Mary Therese, about 45 minutes? Okay, thank you. We'll take about 45 minutes for lunch, and then reconvene together at 12:45 is our kind of our game plan there. So, but between now and lunch, 2 things. One, we want to hear from each of these subgroups, kind of report back on their discussion around their specific portion of that larger document of the ACEs report. And then we'll go into one of our agree, unsure, disagree activities, which is a part of, in the model itself, it's a part of this open dialogue activity. So I'm excited to have us get together with that particular activity. So any questions? I see there's a chat here. Oh, Joy, excellent idea. Oh, gotcha. Okay. All right. Let's see. Let's start with group number 1. And I think when you start to share, I'm going to unshare my screen and you can have the floor. So could we have the reporter from the group number 1? So what are ACEs? What are ACEs? Help us. What did you talk about? 2 minutes. Thank you.
Alan, that's me, Joy, who's going
Okay.
to report on this. So ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, we snuck into page 8, the next page, that in Iowa, 63%, almost 64% of adults have experienced these adverse childhood experiences, and actually more than talk about the content of those childhood experiences, we talked about some of the implications and some of the contributing factors to some of these things, and we kind of expect that that going forward, especially in light of COVID and the challenges economically and emotionally that families have faced, that we'll be seeing that these experiences will probably be on an increase rather than a decrease. And we recognize that so often this is a generational thing. So if you haven't healed something in your own life, the likelihood of passing that on to the next generation of your children or those who come into your realm, that's going to impact how those people are experiencing the passing on some of those experiences of pain. But we also had some hope in the fact that we see that there are systems being put in place to help families in sometimes through workplaces, sometimes through other systems that are looking at some community-based approaches to bring healing to families, but that there is a need for teaching parenting skills, for reminding people of the importance of passing on healthy elements, attitudes to children, and at the same time recognizing that so much in our society of violence or disrespect toward other people, that piece I think you talked about earlier about Al, about retaliation is a common response in much of our culture, and that we need to find ways to reduce the escalation of those attitudes, and thus our participation in our elements today. And lastly, that in our North American culture, we have a lot of reliance on individualism, and that contributes to many of these struggles that are facing our society. That's it. Thanks.
Joy, thank you so much for getting us started into this document. And so, yes, awesome. Let's move on. So from group number 2, your group talked about the prevalence of ACEs, and could we have the reporter share a few thoughts about group number 2's discussion? Thank you.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Thanks, Carmen.
Yeah, I'm holding down my space bar, but I didn't think anybody was hearing me, so thank you very much. So I'm reporting for group number 2, and yeah, I think we were kind of surprised in some ways and yet not surprised by the number of adults who reported that they were experiencing the ACEs. You know, that percentage was 63.7%, and specifically, we kind of focused on the number of adults who reported 4+ ACEs, which was 16.7%. And while it's alarming in some ways, it wasn't too, as we look at COVID and what some of that has created also for numbers to increase. And I think then we kind of went to the map on page 9 and talked about the possibilities of why the numbers might be higher in certain regions of that map. And whether there are resources that are available or not available, could be one or the other. The population that enters into each of those regions, the proximity to reporting sources, like are there colleges or universities in that area, which might also help, well, I shouldn't say help, but increase that number. And then people that may not even realize what's happening in their life and the trauma, it's simply their life. We were talking about the people in the rural areas, it's their life and they're living it, and it's just part of the trauma. They don't really talk about that piece of it. And then a willingness to report, depending on what your culture is. One of the sisters who reported that from India, this was really interesting. I thought how the impact of COVID has created new ACEs for young women who in India who are being encouraged to have earlier marriages because of COVID, being home. And so that was interesting to hear from another culture. So, and then I think the last piece was, let me just see here, the point, the opportunities of people who are experiencing trauma. Specifically, we talked about the children who have alcoholic parents and the ability for them to express their emotions and hopefully come out healthier, for it as they grow, because they have that ability to be able to express how they're feeling. If they don't have that, then it tends to stay within them, and then things can exacerbate in the family lifestyle. So I think that's all we have.
All right, Carmen, thank you so much for sharing those comments about the prevalence. And let's continue on with group number 3, and ACEs and health. Was
Okay.
that portion? Thank you.
Okay. We talked about ACEs and health and how people are carrying a memory in their bodies, sometimes a memory in the muscles, and that this can show up later on in life with bad behaviors. Drinking and smoking are one or a couple of many, but certainly not limited to that, and can reduce the life expectancy up to 20 years, which sounds awful. We talked about homelessness, and people talked about what that is doing to families out of the experience that they worked with. The importance of some people saying, I just wanted to be listened to, and nobody listened. And the devastation of all of that. And so even if it happened a long time ago, in a lot of ways, it's not over. And it's still going on in the life of those individuals. And when the pain is not recognized, not acknowledged, not dealt with, it's like people are sitting on a volcano that's about ready to blow. And so there's a real strong link between those experiences and health in general as people move into and through adulthood.
Thank you, Corinne. Very helpful to the connections that we're making now in the field of public health and the ACEs study and education as well have just been profound, and a lot of motivation and impetus for some policies down the road. So thank you very much. Let's continue on with group number 4.
And that would be our group.
All right.
And following along with what Corinne said, we said trauma affects everything, and we must consider the correlation between the children's trauma and mental health outcomes as an adult. Then we talked about the reference to the infant mental health and how important it is to make sure that a baby is being taken care of in a way that provides a healthy mental health for the baby. And as another group previous said, if this isn't taken care of and help the baby, it becomes a generational problem or issue. Then we talked about the cumulative effect of racism, or how Native Americans have been mistreated, and how that is very ongoing and reaches way back in history. And that right now, what's happening at the border, I think somebody mentioned that, what's happening at the border is deeply traumatizing children, and how that is going to be ongoing. However, education is the key to stopping some of this, and that's helping us on this very day. And that counselors, it was mentioned that if counselors would say not what's wrong with you, but rather what happened to you, we can begin to address with compassion some of what has happened to people. That we need caring adults to give support. And then we talked about how it seems like daycare centers that take care of little children are expected to provide some of this support, and yet the pay that they receive is not saying how important it is of what they're doing. And also, budgets are being cut for mental health resources, and we need to address this at the legislative level so that support is given rather than cut. Thank you.
Jean, thank you. Such important stuff. I love the comment about what's wrong with you, instead of saying what happened. That's the people in the schools and community agencies, the nonprofits working with youth and families, even our faith community. I think just reframing that question helps us not to condone the behavior, whatever the behavior is that's problematic, but to look deeper and say, you know, what happened? Let's work this out together. Group number 5. So to talk about what contributes to ACEs. So thank you, group number 5.
I'll start out again by reiterating the importance of those 2 questions. What's wrong with you should be turned into what happened to you. And when we talk about what contributes to adverse child experiences, it is a long, long list. It can be racism. It can be community violence. I just moved from Minneapolis, and every morning we would have a report about a shooting, a death, or multiple shootings and death. And children grow up in that constant daily reference. It's scary. Your zip code can contribute to your adverse experience. If you live in the wrong place, then you are dealing with a lower economic status. You are dealing with schools that perhaps are not adequately staffed or equipped to be good places of learning. you are dealing with the deterioration in your neighborhood because people can't get loans to improve their house or that kind of thing, that redlining effect. Natural disasters can be causes, and we certainly have heard across our country of flooding and tornadoes and forest fires, and the list goes on and on of what that can do to a child. Health, availability of health services, food insecurity, and also family stability, how the family unit survives in these negative things. So I was just having a conversation the other night with somebody, and we said, aren't we glad we grew up when we did? And I think it's in direct contrast to all the negatives that children could experience now, and how stress, which is powerful, frequent, prolonged, and unpredictable, influences their childhood life, their physical health, as well as their future, how they interpret what's going on around them. So again, in whatever interaction we have with people, to remember the question is not what's wrong with you. The question is what happened to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Sis Jennifer. Thank you very much. Absolutely. Let's continue with group number 6, then, the collective trauma and racism. This trauma.
Yes, thanks, Alan. This is Janet, and I'm reporting for Group 6. We focused on the collective trauma and defining that as trauma experienced by individuals or by everyone who identifies with a particular group that is experiencing trauma or has experienced trauma. And we spent, so that person doesn't need to be the victim at that moment, but seeing on the news or reading about that violence or trauma being experienced by someone that a person identifies with can re-traumatize. And that notion of collective trauma relative to racism, we discussed a lot around what do we, who do we associate with? So, and we talked about being white, and if another white person is a victim of violence or something, are we traumatized when we see that, or do we align with that white person? And we thought with whiteness, we don't necessarily connect with that person. And although as women, if we see another woman, then we identify as a woman. And so we do more likely affiliate or align with that and note and have a stronger reaction to a woman being attacked or violated in some way. And so we had a discussion around that, like, who are the people that we align with and who do we not align with? Who do we say, oh yeah, that's not me? And we said, you know, with people of color, there's racism acting where we well, that's the other and that's not me. And so I don't have the compassion, the same compassion as I do for somebody who looks just like me. We talked also about all the microaggressions that people of color experience. And in the article on page 16, we didn't talk a whole lot about Breonna Ward, her experience, but you know, just this constant barrage of questioning and judging a person because of their color and having these misconceptions and making these assumptions. Also, around healthcare and disparities in healthcare and housing and in opportunities, and all these things just weigh on a person and on the entire collective group. And that contributes to collective grief and trauma and lower health, lower achievement, all these things. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Janet. Perhaps many of you have heard similar reports from public health, but just in terms of the life expectancy, that this last 12 to 14 months has, at least the US as a nation, has seen a decline in life expectancy, I think by roughly 1 year or 12 months in because of the health trauma and things that have been brought on by where we are right now with our global health crisis. But thank you all for taking the time to share with those thoughts. Those collective comments, I think, give us a really nice summary, if you will, of just a portion of that document. And I'm excited for you to, when you have a chance to look at some of the information that's shared in that same document, which gets into some proactive, some policy, community response pieces to that, which would be very consistent with some of the things that many of you have already mentioned, and or at least have identified as maybe some potential strategies, and which could be a part of, a next step. For example, could be how does prevention efforts with this organization, with you as a collective community, keeping in mind the information provided and the insights provided for us by this document or documents like this that talk about and pinpoint, if you will, some of the areas of concern that we can begin to identify again in our own way, in our own sphere of influence, some potential strategies at the local level and building outwards from there. When this report first came out, it kind of sat on the shelf a little bit, like a lot of really excellent reports do oftentimes, or a really awesome curriculum. People get really excited about it, then it kind of just stays there and people don't discover it right away. There are some countries, the UK, we have colleagues in Scotland who the ACEs have helped them build policies and structures around prevention, education, public health. They're using it extensively. And I think we're just beginning in the States to kind of pay attention to this in multiple arenas, multiple systems, public health, education. And those of you from, I know from Ireland, has the ACEs been a point of conversation? I'm curious if you wouldn't mind just saying a word or two about the ACEs work or in your respective parts of the world. If anybody, we can take a minute here or two. New Zealand, Ireland.
Alan, I have to say I haven't encountered this, but that doesn't mean it isn't people are involved in it. But following this day, I will check that out, and I will communicate back with Mary T and Joy.
Fantastic, thank you.
In New Zealand, we do have, we don't call them ACEs, but we certainly have had emphasis at different times put on mental health, children in preschool, and the environment and poverty. So it's similar to what the ACEs are talking about. So I'm also going to see if there is a similar report based on those activities within New Zealand. But we do have a welfare state, so and we do talk a lot about these topics.
Thank you, Ruth. Anyone else? And to Jean, to your question with regards to the states, other states that Iowa has done the ACEs, we have the public health department has followed up with, because of this study, which was actually convened and conducted, I want to say in California, right? Originally, but it has kind of opened the eyes of public health educators, those working in mental health, those of our colleagues who work in corrections or juvenile court services. We really need to pay attention to what this report is saying when we're working with youngsters in that 10, 11, 12 age group, because of the trauma that they've experienced, as this document describes. We really need to rethink about how what corrections and other agencies working in close proximity with education, of course, what we can be doing with regards to interventions, treatments, and really reframe this whole idea of incarceration and isolation. It's really, it needs to be, time is up, time is overdue for some changes and some reform in that area. And I think there's a growing swell of, I think there's an appetite for that, at least with some of the law enforcement officers that I've worked with and am familiar with. They too are thinking about this. So collectively, I think we have some really good momentum. It's a matter of now putting it into practice, right? We're done talking about it. Now let's look at some explicit policies that we can engage in. So it's hopeful, I think, and we can all do our part in helping communicate and promote what this information is telling all of us. This is so widespread. We know that violence and abuse impacts all of our families and all of our communities at some level, right? Maybe not this generation, but maybe previous generations. Maybe not this community, but this community has a history of, or there's examples of forms of oppression, like was discussed in this document, were discussed in this document. So we really do need to really help emphasize that collective responsibility, that collective accountability of what we can do together, and be an inclusive group who sees better ways ahead. So we have one more activity that will take the lunch hour. And this is the part of our training this morning, or our time together, where we will be inviting you to rename yourself, And Mary Therese, you want to give just a really awesome quick update on that again, just to remind all of us?
Sure. I'll just bring up that slide once again. So again, to be able to rename, you can click participants at the very bottom, and then the side will list everyone that's there, and you're going to see your name. You're going to click on more and then click rename. Or if you find your video in the gallery, you can find those 3 dots in the corner and click on the 3 dots and then click rename. So those are the 2 ways you can do it. So through the participants, find your name and more, or click the 3 dots next to your picture. That will also give you the option to rename.
Thank you, Mary Kay. Mary Kay, you could actually kind of moonlight as a tutorial instructor on Zoom. Really, you would be very good at that. So,
thanks.
Yeah, just saying. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen again. So in the spirit of thinking about and thinking about the ACEs, and think about the trauma and the behaviors and the intentional actions and behaviors that we know now have significant impact on our physical, mental, emotional well-being, right? As this study indicates. We talked about this morning about the bystander approach, and that we are all witnesses and observers to behaviors in situations that could potentially be harmful. Again, speaking of children and having worked in education, we know, the millions and millions of youngsters in our state, in our community, in our nation, who are being raised or exposed to violence, domestic violence, or other forms of abuse in their home, which again, this ACEs report, Adverse Childhood Experiences, we know the trauma, the impact it has on brain development, how it has on social emotional learning, etc. So in that spirit, thinking about where we then start to think of more about our response, our sense of responsibility, our sense of a sense of community here. I'm going to share with you or show you a statement on the next slide. And I'm going to invite you to ask yourself whether you agree with the statement or whether you're unsure or whether you disagree, right? So you can choose one of those three words. And then I'm going to invite you, as Mary Therese just described, to go to rename yourself, and in place of your name now, substitute the word agree, unsure, or disagree. And then we'll look at the gallery view, and we can all look to see how did our colleagues respond to this statement. And then I have a few processing questions, and that will take us right up to the lunch hour. So let's begin, shall we? So here's the statement. If a friend is abusive to their partner or is being abused in their relationship, I need to do something. Do you agree with that? Are you unsure, or do you disagree with that statement? Go ahead, and when you're ready, rename yourself. Agree, unsure, or disagree. We'll give you about 45 seconds here. Is there anyone that we could help or provide some additional guidance to? Another way to demonstrate your response is you could put a response in the chat box, or you could go old school and go like this or like this. That's high tech right there, I'm telling you. All right, thank you. So let's do this. Thank you, everyone. And again, you can put a response in the chat box if you'd like as well, or do the manual thumbs up, thumbs down. And we always go like this for I'm not sure. I don't know about that, right? The old flat hand, that works very well. So, okay. So agree, unsure, disagree. So if you look on the screen, and as Mary Kay reminds us, if you click on the arrows on the left and right margin, you can navigate back and forth between the different screens, and you can look to see how are your colleagues here? How are your friends and colleagues responding to this? And I've seen agree, and I've seen a few unsures, and I don't think I see yet any disagrees. So, all right, so here's how this will work. I'm going to invite some volunteers and to respond out loud, if you will, to the larger group as to why you agree or why you're unsure with this particular statement. And I would like to start with those of you who are unsure about this statement. Would anybody be willing to share out loud? Go ahead and unmute yourself and just share a brief statement as to what makes you unsure. We would welcome that. I'll just pause for a moment. So if you're unsure, go ahead and you have the floor.
I marked unsure because I actually know some people in those kinds of situations, and I'm not sure what my responsibility is to butt in, if you will, other than to say something to the person I know best and then let it go at that. That's why I put unsure. I'm not sure how far extensively I should be involved.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I put unsure because I didn't want to make it worse, and I didn't think I had enough information to know that it would be safe for that individual.
Thank you, Corrine.
I put unsure because I feel like I'm judging them.
Thank you. Anyone else? Why
I also put unsure because I need more information.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Let's then move to the agrees, and let's do this. Could I have 3 volunteers to respond out loud as to why you agree with this statement? And if so, just go ahead and unmute yourself and the floor is yours. So 3 volunteers. Who would like to go first?
Was someone else going to speak?
Yep, well, I think we can, either one of you can go first, but we do have 2. So go ahead. And I'm sorry, since you don't have your name on there, I can't call you by name.
I'll go ahead really quickly. My name's Evelyn. And some of the reasons that were given by those who were unsure are still things that I considered to be actions. So I said agree because if I felt I needed to find out more, or I need to at least to speak to the person I know and just, that felt to me like I wasn't ignoring it, I was doing something. So it would really depend on the situation to what degree I acted or how I acted.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. I think our friend from, is it India?
And Maria.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hi.
what I want to say was,
Yeah, why do you?
I agree because that is natural to me. Spontaneously, when I see some injustice or something happening, I seem to be responding, and I feel I need to respond.
Yeah, thank you. And anyone else? Would love to hear.
Go ahead.
For me, I said agree because I feel if I'm a good friend to that person, I feel responsibility to be able to challenge her and to hear more and to help so that maybe she may be living under circumstances which may not be maybe sure to herself. So if I'm a good friend, I feel responsibility to challenge her or to talk to her.
Thank you. Thank you. And one more, and then, yeah, one more would be lovely. One more volunteer.
Bridget has her hand up and Suzanne also started talking, so I don't know.
Okay.
Go ahead, Bridget.
Bridget.
Unmute. You're muted.
I agreed because the domestic violence is really prevalent. There's not a week goes by without incidences here in Yankton, and knowing that that's a small portion, the violence, domestic violence affects the immediate family, so the children in the home or the parents, brothers and sisters. So to do something doesn't mean to interfere with their life, but it might be something to hand them a card, give them a phone number to call for support, give them some indication that you are aware that there is violence occurring and that you are available, maybe just to listen.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And one more, there was one more person that had their hand up. Go ahead. Whoops, and you're muted still. Oh, there you go.
Am I not muted?
We can hear you now. Thank you.
You can hear me now. Well, I've done this twice, and one time it led to action and the situation was solved, and the other time it just made a more aware, and the person was able to look at it a little differently, but didn't change anything. And that's because there's too many implications, especially for a woman. If you don't have the checkbook, if you don't have a car, you're stuck. So I instead went to working in the community, because where I was, any woman needed to go at minimum of 2 hours to get a system or an agency that could help. And so then we finally got an advocate agency in our town. And that agency now has 14 other agencies working out of that center. And so that's a big problem, is there's no place to go in a small rural community. Thank you.
And thank you. And thank you all for sharing those thoughts, and you're thinking that's part of the broader discussion that needs to take place, that can take place with regards to thinking how we collectively understand the challenges that we have and the uncertainty and the, as our colleagues mentioned, unsure, because we're not interested in making things worse, and we don't want to compromise our safety or the safety of those whom we love or those whom we work with, or are challenged to work with. And so hearing examples and different experiences really helps all of us garner and see things from different perspectives that we may not have had the opportunity before. So we will this activity will actually segue into the next activity shortly after lunch. Speaking of lunch, I have a little after 12, so at 12:05 we have, but we're going to take 45 minutes. So Mary Therese, let's set our watch right now for 45 minutes from now to convene back together. So take this time for some nutrition and a break from the screen, stretch. If your outside looks as inviting as some of yours with regards to the weather, please take some fresh air in. So thank you. To one of 10 groups. So we're going to do 10 groups. So most of the groups will have 4, maybe 5. Thank you, MT. About 5 individuals. Group 1 is going to be asked as a group to use and we're going to talk about the Jamboard piece here in just a little bit, but before we do that, let's talk about the instructions. Group 1 is going to, I'll write these in the chat box. Group 1 is going to brainstorm in just in like 3 or 4 minutes, as many words as they can use to describe verbal abuse. What does verbal abuse within the context of relationships sound like? Like, what are the words? What words might you hear that would define verbal abuse in the context of relationships? Group number 2 is going to give examples of emotional abuse. What does emotional abuse sound like and look like in the context of relationships? Group number 3 with technological abuse. What types of abuse are used and perpetrated against others, and where technology is the avenue, or technology is the platform? What types of technological abuse are you familiar with in the context of relationships? Number 4, we'll talk about physical abuse. What does that sound like, look like? Number 5, sexual abuse. What does sexual abuse mean to you in the context of a relationship? So those are groups 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Group number 6. So if when you are assigned to a group, if your breakout room is number 6, you're going to be giving examples of verbal respect. Verbal respect. Group number 7, emotional respect in the context of relationships. What does emotional respect sound like, look like, feel like? Group number 8, technological respect. What does that look like and sound like in 2021? Technological respect. Physical respect, group number 9. What does physical respect within relationships sound like and look like? And finally, group number 10, sexual respect. What does sexual respect sound like and look like in relationships? So you can see each of those numbers 1 through 10, each breakout group is going to be assigned to one of these 10. We've prepared 10 slides using this Jamboard feature And so group number 1 is going to go directly to Jamboard number 1. Group number 2, Jamboard number 2. Group number 3, breakout room number 3 will go to Jamboard 3. So you're going to match your room number, your breakout room with the Jamboard. And when we go to the Jamboard platform, you'll be able to see how to access those numbered boards, pre-numbered boards. So MT, are we ready to figure this out?
We are, yeah. Do you want to show everyone how to do the Jamboard? But all the groups are ready to go. We just need to, so everyone
Sure.
knows.
All right.
I can pull it up if need be.
Let me stop sharing just for 1 second here.
So we assigned each, I think Jesse's reached out to each person if we can. So everyone should have a leader in their group, but if anyone else feels comfortable, feel free to jump in. So one person will handle the technology piece. So it should be easier for your group and the other people can just have input. If there's any questions or if you have trouble, Alan's going to explain it. Feel free to click at the bottom and ask for help and I'll jump in to help out. But Alan will explain.
Yep.
So everyone knows what we're doing.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Thank you for your patience, everyone. And we will go here. I see some of you have found it and discovered it, and good for you. So thanks to MT, you have a link in the chat, which will take you to this document. And my cursor is at the very top here, and I can navigate the different numbered boards by using these left and right arrows. I'm on 8 right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the first one. All right. So verbal abuse is the first of these 10, and that's going to correspond to breakout room number 1. And so you'll click onto that link, you'll go to this document, you'll all be able to hover around, as I see several of you are. On the very left-hand side, in the left-hand margin of this screen, 1, 2, 3, the 4th icon down looks like a sticky note, black and white sticky note. If I click onto that, then I get this screen, this box in the middle of my screen, and it allows me to type in a word or a phrase. And so for verbal abuse, for example, an example of verbal abuse that might be, in regards to a relationship, could be, so one example of hundreds could be making a derogatory negative comment about someone's weight or some other characteristic of them. It could be an example of a derogatory comment of a word, like using language, calling someone or referring to someone as a bitch. Anyway, when these words are typed into the box and you hit the button there, it will create a sticky note, which you can maneuver and put. So what we'll do is we'll ask each of the members of that group to click on this icon and contribute to the population of these sticky notes onto that particular topic. And we'll have you do that, and as many as you can come up with in 4 minutes just to populate that. If you're in group number 2, you'll come up here to the top and you'll click on the number 2 or go to the right one, and there's the emotional abuse. You'll go over here to the far left-hand side, grab the sticky note and type away. And so we're going to give you 4 minutes to do that. And there's a facilitator for each of the 10 groups that will kind of help guide you. This is what I would like us to do. After 4 minutes, you'll receive a message from us to move to the next screen. So now in real life, this is called a gallery walk. And actually it's going to be a little easier doing it online than it is in person. But when we give you the message to move to the next screen, what you're going to do is you're going to go up above here, click on to the next screen to go, in this case, group number 2 will go to number 3. We invite you to look at what that previous group had listed, and we would invite you to contribute and add more examples to that list. So in essence, we're going to be starting off with our first initial poster, create some examples. We will give you a comment or instructions to then move to the next screen up and contribute with some additional words from that to add to that particular poster. If you're group number 10, what we'd like you to do is to go to number 1. So just circle back and go to the number 1 poster. We'll probably do that. I'm going to probably do that about 4 or 5 times. And what we want to do is to have you be able to contribute to multiple examples. And then so we kind of create a richer, more diverse kind of set of tabs or of sticky notes that describe in your words some of how we see some of these behaviors, both abusive and respectful behaviors panning out. So, all right. Any questions or clarification on that? Thank you for your patience with that. And yeah, I think we are ready to go.
So just one quick clarification for the people that I reached out to. So hopefully everyone in your group will be able to click the link for themselves and interact with the Jamboard. If not, the people that I reached out to, if you could click the link and share your screen, and then you could add the sticky notes for your group, would be an alternate way to do it. If everyone in the group doesn't want to click the link and negotiate the Jamboard. Does that make sense? Or if there's someone else in the group that feels comfortable doing that as well, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Jesse. Hopefully you all can see the Jamboard. So thank you, well done. And it's always interesting to always learn more about these platforms, especially when we were asking and inviting you to participate on more than one board, that this automatically starts to create additional boards, 11, 12, 13, every time we look on. So, but yeah, thank you for your thinking on this. And as we kind of want to do is to kind of take like a 10,000 foot view of what you all helped create. Again, thinking about the Socratic model of the operational definition, if you will, the examples that you come up with for each of these different categories. And so having you have a chance to contribute to the board, you're familiar with a lot of what's already been shared, but let's just look at these together real quickly, again, from that kind of that 10,000 foot view. So looking at verbal abuse and the different ways in which individuals within a relationship could, behavior from a bystander's point of view, from an observable point of view as a witness, we might hear or observe any of these things that are on these sticky notes. When it comes to emotional abuse, so taking a look at some examples there, I'll just pause for a moment as you scan the different examples that are listed. I would also invite, if someone is unfamiliar with a phrase or a term, if you would unmute yourself and say, could someone tell me more about, and then state the phrase or the ticket, if that's the case. So as you look on here, would isolation contribute or be a part of this emotional abuse? A partner isolating their other partner from other friends, family, etc. Isolation could be a contributor, or could have been listed on here. Maybe it is. I haven't seen it yet.
I agree. I agree. Isolation should be there.
Yeah, let's put that on there. Thank you. I would encourage, as we go through here, please, these are your boards, these are our boards. If there's something that you want to add that's not listed there, I would strongly encourage you to do that. So thank you. Let's continue on here to look at the technological abuse, the different ways in which harm and it can be disseminated through digital media, sexting, demanding passwords, thank you, pornography, fake stories for sure, doctored photos, dark web, thank you, Zoom bombing.
Yes. Hello.
Hello.
What's Zoom bombing?
Yeah, who would like to answer that question? Zoom bombing. Any volunteers? Go ahead, Brian. Unmute yourself first, Brian. Here you go.
Thanks, Alan. A Zoom bombing is when you are in a Zoom meeting and then all of a sudden some uninvited person will come in and then suddenly, with their own audio, or there might be pornography images, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's kind of breaking into another's meeting.
Thank you. Yeah. There have been some just horrific stories of that happening.
I participate in an event on Fridays, and it's a faith reflection group. And every so often among the group in Facebook, someone comes in and it's a person who is scamming. I guess it's not the same as Zoom bombing, but it's another abuse.
Yeah. Thank you. In the chat box, Anne Marie, thank you for typing that in. In our group, only one person was able to type in. We were hoping as many folks as possible would be able to create and generate their own sticky note. And if you were unable to do that, we apologize. You could, if you could pull that link back up, and if you had an opportunity and wanted to add anything to those lists, you're surely more than welcome to. And I'm sorry that you weren't able to do that. And you said yours as well. You were unable to respond or to add. Only one person could type. I'm not sure if that could have been for offering up suggestions, and if it was easier if one person typed or if all contributed. We were open to either scenario. There was no one right way to do this other than brainstorm together some words, get the phrases put on the place on the sheets themselves. Thank you.
We spoke our suggestions and one person typed, and it worked well.
Okay. And thank you. And also too, as I was mentioning to MT earlier, that this particular platform just provides just another really great example of ways to brainstorm, for teams to brainstorm together. So thank you for that. If we move on here and we'll look at physical abuse, so you can see the different types of words and phrases that you all kind of came up with together on there. And into sexual abuse, so things like coercive behavior, date rape, prepping, untouching, trafficking. Thank you for contributing that, for adding that. Groping. And the personal pleasure would be, not sure the person who contributed that, but thinking about where we're not, our together time or intimate time it should be mutual and not necessarily for one person over the other. So thank you for adding that. And so one more here, let's go on to verbal respect. So looking at the ways now, taking a shift and thinking of the different ways we can show up or to demonstrate verbal respect. So take a look at those if you haven't already, taking a look at those examples that are listed there. Again, with the link in the chat box, if you want to add a word that's not there, you are welcome to do that as we go through these here real quickly. Verbal respect, emotional respect. Thanks for using the different colors. Those are exciting to look at. Choosing to spend time with someone, just picking out a few here, not saying don't feel that way, right? It's like we feel how we feel. Eye contact, demonstrate caring smiles, giving someone a blessing and telling them that they are a blessing. Thank you. You brighten my day. These are great examples. Thank you for using I statements. Thank you for that. Technological respect. Sharing the remote. I love that. Sharing the remote, responding to emails, taking time to help. Again, we're so appreciative of Jesse and MT today to helping us with the technology. Patient with someone who tries to respond, respecting others' ideas. Sending someone you care about in a relationship, sending them a kind word, a thought, a photo, remembering them on their birthday or other special events, and finding positive ways to use technology. It really is endless, isn't it? I mean, when we think about it.
I've seen it in care centers and heard about so many ways by which staff at care centers have helped the residents as well as the families because of technology being able to be assistant.
Yeah, Beth, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, it's rethinking some ways because of COVID, maybe perhaps, or others, of how we communicate. And the final board here that we'll look at together is on sexual respect. So no means no, and being consensual, treating people with kindness, honoring that person's space, right? Using preferred pronouns. Thank you for that.
Respecting boundaries.
Respecting boundaries. Thank you. Yes. All right. Thank you. All right. Yeah, I just switched to a PowerPoint. Do you see the slide in front of you, types of abuse?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So when we look at these different ways in which harm can surface, think to yourself just for a moment, why might I put these particular words in this order? Again, there's not a right and wrong response to this, but would there be any benefit or when looking at verbal, emotional, physical, sexual, those behaviors from left to right? Any reason why you think we might talk about those or look at those in that particular order? And when you're ready, if you have a response, would you mind unmuting yourself and feeling free to share out loud?
I think sometimes the people start with verbal abuse before they move on to some of those other types. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like a testing of the waters in some ways. If the person lets me get away with this verbal abuse, then I up it to emotional, then I can up it. I don't know about the technological, but the physical and the sexual, it can kind of be as it progresses.
Yeah. Thank you, Rita. Yeah, so as she mentioned, it can maybe some forms of abuse, when abuse does occur in a relationship or begin to occur, could it be more of a verbal or emotional nature? Thank you. Who would add to that? Anything else that you would add? What strikes you with regards to the order of these?
Verbal abuse. Verbal abuse.
Also, I'm thinking of verbal abuse would be one of the easiest to talk about because it has an audience, and going down into more secretive, more difficult to talk about because often the physical abuse and the sexual abuse are secret and are asked to stay secret. Sometimes, don't you tell anybody that I did this to you.
Yeah, thank you, Bridget.
I think for me, it's that if a relationship starts with verbal abuse, it's time to bring an end to it before it goes further.
Yes. Mary Lou?
Verbal abuse would and emotional too would apply to all age groups.
Yes. When you think about the general population and in these different types of forms of abuse, where do you think in general, this is a kind of a general kind of question, where do you think most people feel compelled to want to help or to do something? Where, maybe perhaps where on this, from left to right, on this continuum, if you will, where do you think majority of folks might find themselves most compelled to want to intervene or to help? Again, there's no right or wrong response to that. And if someone wants to unmute and share out loud, I would welcome that.
I feel emotional. Emotional can break down the person and they lose all their self-esteem, you know, they can be destroyed as a person.
Okay, thanks, Anne Marie. So seeing that emotional abuse is some of that, people would say, wow, I really need to do something. I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but that really concerns me. Anyone else have a sense of where you think the general population might feel most compelled to?
Physical abuse, you can see it. There's signs of it. And that's most often taken into the emergency room. You don't see someone taken into the emergency room usually because they're verbally or emotionally abused. But physical, the arm is broken or whatever. You can see it and it can be physically fixed. The other scars are deeper.
Thank you.
Those things.
I would say physical abuse too, because it's unavoidable. I can't not see it.
As I think back to my upbringing, if I was being verbally abused by my brothers and sisters, I was told to suck it up and things like that. I think in our society, we're expected to learn how to put up with verbal abuse and stand up for ourselves and maybe even throw it back. But when it got to physical abuse, my parents would definitely step in and you do not hit. So I wonder if our society perhaps has some, where we will interfere depends upon how we expect people to take it or not take it.
Yeah. Thank you, Rita, for sharing that.
I think these things are challenging to our criminal justice and legal system because usually evidence means something you can see.
Thank you, Beth. Right, and certainly on the right-hand side of this continuum, when you think about the laws that are laws and policies in place, there are certainly some explicit policies that speak to physical and sexual abuse, as you mentioned, with evidence, right? With the evidence, and whereas verbal and emotional is maybe not as easy to prove or to have evidence, right? Potentially. So, yeah. So when you were going through, let me stop just for a moment. I want to have you think about that activity before we take a quick break. When we were inviting you to move from slide to slide and you were looking at different words and coming up with some examples, and then we had you moved. Some of you, or most of you were able to contribute to both the types of abuse examples and also some of the respect examples, right? You were able to do both. As you were going through that activity, did you find it more challenging or more difficult to come up with examples of one of those categories, either the abusive or the respect? Did anybody have any feelings either way about which broader category was more challenging or maybe not more challenging? What are your thoughts about that? Anne Marie writes, some find emotional abuse is easier than verbal abuse in terms of to respond to or to come up with examples. Thank you.
I found the technological abuse very difficult, maybe because we're not quite familiar with it, maybe in my own setting.
Okay, Judith. Thank you. Judith, was it helpful to look at that board to see some examples of technological abuse? Was it helpful to see that?
Oh, yes, yes. Some of them I've had, but some of them, like, that's why I was asking some of the things, maybe it's a language, I don't know.
Yeah. Thank
yeah,
you.
but it was difficult.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Anyone else? Did you find one of those categories more challenging? Bridget writes, at first glance, the boards from abuse were more full than boards that show respect. Would that be an observation that others would have, that maybe it was easier to come up with examples of abuse versus the contrary, the respect examples? Any thoughts on that?
I think we moved slower. I mean, at the beginning, we were going kind of slow. And if we had, been pushed along a little bit, we would have filled in the others better.
Okay.
We spent more time on the first part.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
That was my feeling.
Sure. Yeah, Brian?
It's always easier to focus on the negative than the positive.
Okay.
I could generate all kinds of negative, examples.
Yeah, thank you. Did anyone else feel similar to Brian or any other type of observation? Thank you, Brian.
I felt the same way. It was much easier to respond to the abusive ones than it was to give positive.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I think it depended where you started as well, because we started on the positive, the group I was with, and because we started there, we had more time on those, and I think that was part of it.
Okay. All right. So thank you. So maybe depending on the order of where you started, anybody else, and any other observations with regards to finding it easier or more difficult?
I don't know that it was the topic. It was harder to find positive wording on the respect side. We knew the negative, how we wanted to say it negatively, but.
Yeah. Thank you, Sister Pat. I didn't give you any instructions about this, but what I was really impressed with was the affirmative, that you listed things for the respect, for verbal respect and emotional in the affirmative, right? As opposed to saying not this or not that, right? You were affirmative, and that's, I think, is where we want this activity certainly allows itself to kind of call out some of the attraction that maybe our mind or maybe a society, if we perseverate on the negative piece, the negative, and that's where we go to, and we think about maybe growing up having rules and regulations. And remember when we'd walk into a classroom as a young person and there would be a list of do's and don'ts, right? And it's like, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And, how have we, maybe through some of our, work in the area of child development and social media, maybe have finding ways in which to think about the positive framing. What norm are we trying to promote, right? And the positive things. I think another thing that maybe some of you may have thought of as you think about when you think about media, we think about the nightly news, or we think about the cable news in general, we know that stories around harm and abuse and violence are often the lead story. So it's almost as if we're just programmed and ingrained in that negative, newsworthy piece, and all of the feel-good stories, all of the good citizen or good Samaritan stories seem to me to be always the last, maybe that last story that a news anchor will share before going off the air, right? Now, saving the best for last could also be the rationale there as well, but it's interesting how I think we, as a society, how we consume news, and those which are negative or maybe most egregious and violent seem to get top billing. Would anybody have an observation or a similar observation or something contrary to that? I'll just pause for a moment. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Negative press sells more.
Mm.
And the press also, the media, I think, uses really emotional, high intensity words when they report their negative things as opposed to the positive pieces. I mean, they really ramp it up.
Yes, thanks, Julia. And
the breaking news is always bad. It's never good. They never, here's breaking news, you know, like something wonderful happened. It's usually somebody died, some kind of disaster, some kind of a gun shooting, something. But we never have breaking news that's good news.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
But when you do a presentation or something, you get maybe 5 compliments and then you get 1 criticism. Where does your attention go?
That's a great question, Rita. Thank you for sharing that. So going into break, one final piece here, and then we'll take a 10-minute break. I love using different models and different visuals, and this is one that would be consistent with the activity that we just finished. When we think about prevention, realistically, what we can do in our spheres of influence is to really pay attention to the behaviors around verbal and emotional. Those, as was mentioned, some of those behaviors that could be precursors to, if not challenged and confronted, could lead to maybe more egregious behaviors. This pyramid, for example, gives us a visual depiction of what that might look like. The MVP model, which we'll be facilitating this afternoon, focuses on behaviors that land more on the lower part of this pyramid than the higher part, than at the very top. The behaviors at the very top, murder, rape, sexual, physical assault, there are individuals within our society, in our communities, who are trained and who work towards addressing or investigating or dealing with those behaviors that typically isn't in our set of skills necessarily, but what we can do as individuals, as friends, as family members, as co-workers, we can pay special attention to the behaviors more towards the bottom. And when we see and observe those, we can begin to ask ourselves, what could I do? What should I do? And that's where we're going to head here this afternoon. So thank you for your conversations and your willingness to share out loud. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll reconvene back here. I have 2:10 on my watch, so 2:11 now, excuse me. So at 2:21, we will reconvene here. All right, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for hanging in there. How's everybody doing? On a scale from 1 to 10, 10 is, I'm feeling great. And 1 is, boy, I could use a nap right now. How are you feeling? How are you feeling? You can show me by hands. We have 8, thank you, Joy. We have 10, Jen. 8 as well. Thank you very much, Rita. 9 and 9, okay. And 5. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Got it. Yep. So, yep, 7. Yeah, I'm in that 7 to 8 range as well. For some reason, I didn't get my 8 hours of sleep. Thank you. And Ruth, 6. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, we knew going into today would be a very long day, and I'm so appreciative of everyone's contributions and comments, perspectives that are taking. And so I would like to invite Janet. Janet sent me a really, really great point in the chat with regards to this last activity in the pyramid, which I really appreciate. And I think it's worth noting too. I mean, I'd be willing to share. Janet, would you be willing to share out loud your kind of one of your observations or a perspective when we talk about that pyramid of violence? Thank you, Janet.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. You didn't know you were going to do this.
No, I mean, I just mentioned to Alan that I wondered who created that pyramid and how it was determined. I mean, I'm making an assumption that the lower half of the pyramid articulate lower levels of violence. And the fact that racism is on the very bottom rung. And I think racism is one of the most violent things in our world. And so to put that down at the very bottom, and it's well below, you know, pushing or slap or pushing somebody, I think is wrong, or I don't agree with that categorization. And I was asking, like, I wonder if different groups of people might put any of those maybe in different places. And do we make assumptions, or do we see that, and then does that reinforce our you know, implicit bias or our prejudices? Yeah, and would men make a different pyramid? Like, would men put rape down lower? So anyway, I think it was, yeah, I was just kind of asking some of those questions.
Great questions. And that pyramid is actually a generalized pyramid that we have used several times, not just myself, but others. But to your point, I absolutely think that there's the continuum of abuse with regards to how words have power, which is another kind of outcome of that discussion, and others like it, that words have power. And when we look at slurs, language with regards to race, gender, etc., they are no less abusive than physical or manifestation. In fact, I would those of you who work closely with victim service agencies have probably heard survivors of sexual abuse, survivors of domestic violence talk about the severity of the emotional abuse in comparison to, and from their perspectives, some of the physical abuse. And I mean, every survivor's experience is different, of course, but yeah, I really appreciate, Janet, you sharing that observation. It makes sense. Appreciate it. All right.
I would also say that it's the foundational. I don't see it as lesson. I see it as foundational to all the others.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So, which is, again, when we think about prevention, and prevention is about building capacity. It's about building a coalition of individuals who can observe and witness behaviors that are potentially within our realm to address in a way that we can address other situations with colleagues, with friends. The MVP model draws a distinction between being an observer or a witness to a potentially harmful situation within the confines of our peer groups, whether they be, family or friendships or, collegial of any nature. And how do we navigate in those circles, and how do we respond, and how do we show up in those situations when we can be, a way to de-escalate or challenge or, work to intervene, but we're doing it in our with some familiarity. That's a different situation than being privy to or observing something that happens maybe in the community, or visiting a different city or a different country and observing and seeing things happen where you have limited, if any, familiarity with the individuals involved. You might see a potential, crime or abusive behavior in acting out or in action, and oftentimes, our natural instinct would be primarily probably to alert, law enforcement or security services or someone in a position of authority, which is a response, right? But the examples that we're going to look at when we talk about the MVP model, we're looking at addressing situations in social environments where we have some relationship or some connection with that person. This is what is the reason why we focus on that as a parameter, is because, again, of safety, that it's less, it's not 100%, but it's less likely that there would be potentially physical retaliation within a group of individuals with whom I know that I either work with or am associated with in some way. It's not that it can't happen, but it's not as likely, and that there are the interventions and the approaches to that make sense perfectly when you think about personal safety and what's within our realm of possibilities, right? And how can we maximize our influence and our leadership within our circles of influence in ways in which that could be incredibly helpful and positive for the broader community. So it's, again, I draw that distinction to demonstrate that there are individuals who have responded in the community with perfect strangers to intervene. And there's a risk with that. There's a risk of personal harm to that particular decision, right? And of course, in our work with schools and community leaders, we try to focus on let's handle and let's pay attention to the potential harm and abuse that's happening within our spheres of influence, and which I've mentioned before. So there's a distinction there that I want to be clear about. This next activity, I am going to invite you to walk through a visualization. I'm going to invite you to listen as I read a short paragraph, which is going to describe a situation, a social situation. And I want to be very transparent. I'm going to be asking you to imagine a person that you care about being verbally assaulted. I'm going to ask you to imagine that in your image. If you don't want to do that, you just you can turn the mic off or turn the sound down and not participate, and that is absolutely okay. Otherwise, I would invite you to, when you're ready, I would invite you to, this will take probably about maybe 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes, not very long at all. But I will invite you to go ahead and sit in your chair in a very comfortable position with your feet flat on the floor. And if you are so inclined, you can just lower your gaze a little bit for your eyes, or you can close your eyes altogether. But I'm going to read an excerpt and ask you to imagine what it is that I'm describing. And then we have some processing questions that I'm going to invite you to discuss in small groups. So when you're ready, if you want to participate, go ahead and close your eyes or lower your gaze, or you can turn the sound off and just wait momentarily for a couple minutes, and we'll be moving right along. So just go ahead, relax, close your eyes. So imagine it's a person you care about the most. Could be your mother, your father, a sister or brother, a friend, a coworker, an aunt. Imagine this person is at a party or simply walking down the street. Now imagine that there's another man in the scene. He sees the woman that you care about. He approaches her and verbally assaults her or him. Now imagine there's a third person in the scenario, a bystander. The bystander is in a perfect position to help, but chooses to do nothing. The bystander either watches or walks away. Okay, you can open your eyes. Thank you for that. No, that's not always easy to imagine someone that you care about being harmed, whether it be virtually or verbally or emotionally or physically. I'm putting in the chat box some questions that I'm going to invite you to discuss in small groups. The first question is, how did it make you feel to have a person you care about being verbally assaulted? How did you feel about that? How did it make you feel? Number two, how do you feel about the bystander, the person who either watched or walked away? Number three, if you had to describe the bystander in your visualization, what words would you use? And finally, number four, what impact might this assault, this verbal assault, have on the person you care about deeply? Those four questions, I'm going to invite you to spend just a few minutes. So MT, Mary Therese, let's set the timer for 10 minutes, and let's go again. I think 10 groups, so 5 persons per group would be fine. And the questions are in the chat box for you to refer to, and I'll have Mary Therese send us off here shortly. All right, welcome back, everyone. So thank you for your thinking on that. And as I share my screen and just repost, if you will, the questions that you responded to, the exercise that you just walked through, we oftentimes call it the visualization, or we call it the empathy exercise. And the intent of that activity is to put ourselves in the shoes of an individual who is being harmed, and where the person who is nearby, who sees what's happening, chooses to do nothing. And in your brief discussions that you had just briefly, I'd like to just focus on a couple of the questions that were there, if I could. The first one is, number two, how did you feel about the bystander, or the person who watched and walked away? What were some, and feel free to put these in the chat box, your response, and or I would welcome anybody to unmute themselves and to share out loud. What were some of the thoughts and thinking around how you felt about the bystander in your visualization? So I'll pause there for a moment and welcome any comments. Thank you. So thank you. So words like disgusted, fear, being upset, disbelief, afraid, disappointed, and angry. Yeah, thank you. And I'd understand, because as Carol writes, what if the attacker was armed? Absolutely. Frustrated that the bystander didn't do anything. Think of the George Floyd situation. Thank you. Right. Yes, thank you. Then what happened to you? Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah. It's almost, there's a chance that there's maybe some, feeling empathetic or empathy for this person who was observing this happening and maybe not knowing what to do or how to do anything. And them leaving the situation was about, they could have been fearful themselves or scared. It's again, hypothetical situation, but having empathy for the bystander is not uncommon in that response. Being angry and upset is also very common as well. Thank you. The other question, the second question I'd like to ask you to think about and then be willing to share either out loud or in the chat box is number 4. So what impact might this verbal assault have on the person that you care about? What impact might that incident have on this person that you care about? Go ahead and think about that. When you're ready, respond in the chat box or unmute yourself and share out loud. Thank you. Yeah, Brian writes traumatizing. Anne-Marie, sad, disheartened. Again, fear, afraid. Thank you. Evelyn, distrust of the world, right? Destroy their self-esteem. Thank you, Rita.
Feeling victimized.
Thank you. Minimalized. Thank you, Jennifer. Diminished of self-esteem. Anne-Marie writes, kind of asking the question, why me? Why am I the person that this person is treating me so poorly? Yes. Sometimes there isn't a good answer. Thank you. Could be long-term negative impact. And what could that? Think of Janet's statement about long-term. What kind of long-term impact might that be?
An example. It might have brought up.
Sorry, no, it is.
It might have brought up other victimizations at another time. Childhood memories.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, self-doubt, a trigger, trauma, fear, absolutely. Thank you everyone for contributing this. Yeah, could be put down for life, loss of confidence, absolutely. Begin to see yourself as being less than, and you create this narrative. Their effect on education and development, or the correct impact on their work, their productivity, their ability to be a good partner, a good employee, a good friend, feeling less than. Thank you. All right. And 2 more here. Physical, medical issues. Yes, thank you. Withdraw from society, withdraw from friends, withdraw from resources. Could have, in severe cases, they could be thinking of self-harm, afraid to be by themselves or go out by themselves, withdrawn from society. Yes, thank you. So this brings us to our culminating activities, where let's discuss and let's talk about what are the explicit ways that some have already been mentioned in some examples of things that we could say and or do. And when we were looking at the statement earlier about if a friend of ours was abusing their partner or conversely being abused, right? I need to do something. That idea about how do I show up and what do I say? I don't want to make things worse, right? And some of you took the risk and shared some personal examples of things that you had done yourself and shared some of the positive outcomes, or maybe outcomes that were hard to determine if it was helpful or not. So, those examples are real. But what I've always appreciated, again, about this model was the way that we were able to talk explicitly about examples. And again, tapping into our skill set and the ways in which we demonstrate leadership and how we approach conversations, and as well as our personalities, our our affect, how we interact naturally. Part of being a good friend and a good ally and someone who, wants to be proactive and challenge and confront abusive behaviors is being ourselves and being authentic and not trying to be somebody that we're not, but to be who we are and to be the best version of that. This is one of the best ways that we can, I think, communicate and promote and encourage others to be themselves in situations where they could be potentially helpful. And so we talk about 5, generally speaking, different ways, different categories that we can come up with some examples. The first one is direct. Responding directly with words or a deed to the aggressor or to the person that's being harmed, right? Or both. So in other words, observing something that's happening, and because I have some familiarity with one or more of those parties, I have a stake in this. I have some, people call it the phrase, I have some skin in the game, right? That this is somebody that I know, that I care about, that I have a relationship with, either the person who's being aggressive or the person who's being targeted, and it bothers me. And maybe my personality is such that I'm a direct person. Like I just kind of call things as they are. If that's my personality, that's probably how I approach a lot of challenging moments, right? Not just regarding preventing abuse or bullying or harassment, but how I approach often other areas as well. So if I'm direct, if my personality is such, that might be a really good response or a way in which I might show up in that situation. I might also, in terms of protocol, I might know the person or persons who are involved in whatever the situation may be. I may know somebody who is in a position of authority that could help, right? Responding as a proactive social bystander, as a good friend, is not about getting individuals, in trouble with the law or other types of penalties. It's about handling social situations as they emerge at the earliest point, potentially, where I can have some positive impact, again, because of my status and because of my familiarity. But I also may know some people of authority that can help me maybe be that really proactive bystander. If I'm not a direct person, if I'm more a person who kind of like operates under the radar or, in the background, or I get things done, my leadership style is kind of behind the scenes. If that's you, if that describes kind of your style of leadership, then you might shift the focus. You might use a distraction. You might use humor. You might tell a story. You might change the topic. You might introduce some other conversation in the midst of what could be maybe some language or words or some attitudes that maybe would be, as we talked about, on the left of the continuum, more verbal, emotional, etc., where we have maybe a way to communicate our displeasure by using a distraction, and what that distraction would be. It could be humor. Some of you are naturally very funny. You're naturally gifted with regards to words and humor, and that might be the skill, your leadership skill, in a situation that would warrant some type of de-escalation or challenging, in an indirect sort of way that you're not okay with what's happening, and this again is in the sphere of your influence. After the fact or next day, I can't remember who it was this morning, but when you mentioned the idea that you didn't have, you may have been in a situation in the past where you didn't know what to say, but later on you remembered, or you thought to yourself, gosh, if I just would have said this, or if I would have done this. Sometimes that's how real life works. We don't necessarily know because something might catch us so off guard that it kind of stops us in our tracks. It almost freezes us, by the way, that we might not be thinking. I need to process that, because that's my style. My style is to process and to think things through. And I may come up with a really great comment or some demonstrate some sign of support later on afterwards. What would that look like and sound like? So if my style is I'm more of a processor, I'm maybe more indirect, etc., but I might not respond right then and there, but that could be okay, and that would be all right, because that's more true to your style.
but I could come back later on or follow up in a different way, right? Which is really helpful. I might be a person who really appreciates and excels when I'm working in a group or when I feel like I've got some close allies and friends with me. My sense of courage, my knowing that folks have my back, I have their back. Maybe that's what energizes me and gives me clarity and some ideas and thoughts of things that I can do, not by myself, but in a group, right? And if that's your style, if that describes who you are more authentically, then it would stand to reason that an approach, should you be witnessing something potentially harmful unfolding, that might be the strategy or the approach that you would undertake. So again, the idea here is how can we align our response as an active bystander, as a good friend or coworker, in collaboration with who I am as a person in my normal daily routine, personality, my approach, those types of things. And so that's how we then teach getting folks to think about what could they say and do. So knowing that these categories now lend themselves to thinking explicitly, what would it sound like in a direct response? What would it look like using a distraction? So coming up with examples. So what we're going to do is now invite you to apply some of those categories for you to come up with explicitly some examples in a group on your own. So in just a moment, we're going to send you into small groups of roughly 5 groups. So there'll be 7 folks per group. And in the group, you're going to pull up, you have 2 documents to look at. One is a document that has 5 social scenarios. We call them MVP scenarios. So there are 5 social situations and they're numbered 1 through 5. Like before, so breakout group 1 will invite you to take a look at and pull up slide number 1, scenario number 1, that's listed there. Group number 2, breakout room number 2, you will pull up and look at scenario number 2, and group number 3, scenario 3, and so on. So there's 5 scenarios, there's 5 groups. Each group will be looking at a different scenario because they're all different situations, which you'll see when you open those up. But as a group, I want you to use this document here on my screen as your pathway to facilitate. If we were, in schools or other organizations where we do these in person, we cluster groups into numbers of 8 to 10 people, and we have cards that have these questions on them, and so each person takes turn asking a question, and then the other group members respond. And so the idea here is what we want you to do in the next 30 minutes is to use these questions to guide your conversation as you walk through the scenario. Now, to do that, and so you'll get through all these 10 questions. You'll notice that in the center of this document in red print are the examples that I just went over with you just a moment ago with regards to some categories. And so what we're asking you to do is if you can identify with one of those categories, what's an explicit example that you could see yourself doing in response? Those will be the kinds of questions that we'll be getting at in this discussion. So in the small groups, here we go. All right, so how it will work is Mary Therese is going to prepare to put you into one of 5 groups. What we'll ask each group is to identify the scenario number to same number as your group number. We'll ask for a volunteer. You want a volunteer to read the scenario out loud, which is about 2 or 3 sentences. You want a different volunteer to read the train of thought, which is a paragraph. So you'll read both of those paragraphs first, presumably by 2 different individuals. And then you'll begin to go through those questions 1 through 10 and respond to them. Now, given 25 minutes to do this, do the math, it's about 2 minutes per question. So if there could be kind of an impromptu timekeeper, if you will, but to be able to move through those questions, not too fast, but not too slow. Think about 2 to 2.5 minutes per question after you've read the scenario, after you've read the train of thought, and then you'll get into the questions themselves. And we'll start at 25 minutes and we'll check in to see how you're doing. So with that, I know there's some questions here in the chat. Let me see here. Yes, we'll copy and paste those. Thank you very much. And let me do that right this second.
The links to the slides, the situations are in the chat, as well as the questions. So as long as one person in your group can access them, that would probably be helpful. You can always share your screen, and that's possible, but they're in the chat, so that will be there when you open in your groups as well. That helps.
Thank you, Mary Therese. Let's take, we want to, a couple of things. One, we want to be mindful of everyone's time here. We want to just ask, when we come back from break, just revisit the scenario experience. And I want to say a few words about the other scenarios, that the ones that you weren't able to look at, but you will have access to. And then we want to spend a little bit of time doing some processing and some next steps, and then be done either at or before 4:30. So let's take a 5-minute break if we can do that and hold ourselves to that, and come back here in 5 minutes. Stretch, take care of personal needs, and we will see you shortly. Thank you. Well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for returning so promptly. Let me just share my screen here real quickly. What I want to do is just take a few minutes here right now just to share real quickly the different scenarios that you were all utilizing, although not the same, but different ones. The first one has to do with recognizing that somebody who you know in the parking lot with this confrontation between appears to be two spouses. You're familiar with one of them. You see them in church services, etc. But there's some aggression that's happening, and so that catches your eye. So I hope that whoever the group number one who had this, I hope you're able to. Well, first of all, I hope that you found all of the scenarios when you asked the first question out loud to each other. Is this realistic? Could this happen in our community? My intent was to identify and create scenarios that would be potentially relevant to the audience. This is what, when we do our trainings, this is what changes the most with regards to our focus areas, is that all of our scenarios are meant to be about situations that might happen in our purview, in our travel. So the first one was about a couple. The second one, for those of you who hadn't seen it, was you're at a meeting and a female colleague has an idea that's shared in the meeting, and no one says anything directly, but then a male colleague says something. And you know, this is again one of those things, whereas myself personally never noticed this because of my privilege and because of how I go into meetings, but it was made very clear to me that this happens a lot with my female colleagues, and even my daughters, when they talk about meetings that they have in their professions, this has surfaced. So this is again one that we've used before. So thank you for group number two for talking about that one. Group number three. So this, again, trying to be as relevant as possible. This could fit underneath kind of workplace bullying umbrella, if you will, but in terms of being overcritical and criticizing, etc., but having it come off to be in sort of a, nonchalant, well, I'm just kind of a kidding attitude. This is, again, where we can see some of the beginning potential signs, if you will, of, verbal or emotional harm being done that maybe is played off as being innocent, when in fact it's having some significant consequences to the person who's being targeted. This scenario is a really tough one because it's happening in real time for us in our communities across the country and around the globe, where individuals are targeted based on their race and nationality, right? And we're seeing this. It's a tough one, and when it does happen, it's one of those scenarios where, protocol, where we think about, some type of authority person, especially if it happens in this scenario, it happens in a shopping area where there's, potentially pop up, the public is there, you've got people coming and going. You're not the only one who sees or observed this. This would be, in a similar situation like we saw unfold with George Floyd, et cetera. But again, not involving police per se, but involving someone who feels compelled to degrade and harm and verbally abuse someone of a different, potentially different nationality. This is a hard one, but it's like I said, it's happening in real time. And this last one here, regarding again some of the belittling and criticizing behaviors of a coworker, innocent teasing. So I think 3 and 5 were of a similar tone, a similar nature, and but anyway, so the idea was to look at take those questions and how those questions build up by asking the question like, what do you notice? Why might people be silent in those situations? Again, thinking back to our conversation this morning with regards to the barriers that keep bystanders from responding, which we have to know what they are, and so that we can work to counteract, or we can be able to support the individuals to, potentially not use silence as a default, but that there's something that I can do. Again, making sure that safety is a priority. And again, how I do that and how I show up could be as unique and as different as there are folks on this training today. And that was the intent. And then getting to the point where you can talk about some explicit examples. And the thing that I've always liked about this process is, again, the Socratic model indicates that the answers lie within us. And the creativity that people come up with in terms of how they might respond or how they saw somebody else respond is something that many of us maybe sometimes never would even thought of. And we think about how that would look if I tried to do something of a similar, or how would I put my personal spin on that to, again, respond to the opportunity to do something in a positive pro-social way after the fact, the next day, right then and there, et cetera. So again, these are the examples that we use, that I hope you would use to create and to share and to encourage others. You can begin to see very clearly that in any organization, in any system where there are multiple individuals living or working together, you can imagine that when you look at examples like these, and there's this kind of social agreement that these behaviors are potentially harmful or are harmful themselves, and that we understand that it's part of our responsibility and part of our acts of demonstrations of leadership to respond in a pro-social way. And that if I do something or challenge something, I'm going to be more likely to believe that my peers are socially supporting what I'm doing and potentially will join. And this whole idea of creating that critical mass, that's the positive social norm that we want folks to be able to find ways to exploit, to exaggerate the positive social norms that are much more prevalent, but not necessarily communicated or expressed. And that kind of helps decrease the silence as a potential option. So again, thank you for your thinking about those. I would just pause for a moment here and invite anybody here to either in the chat box or in the unmute yourself and just take a couple of minutes to respond in the chat box, maybe a takeaway for you from the scenarios, either chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and share out loud. I'll give you a couple of minutes here and then we'll move on to the last activity. So thank you. Again, thank you for taking the time to write in the chat box your thoughts. Can't emphasize enough how helpful those comments will be for your leadership team as they help process the day's events and some next steps, which is where I want to go, and then we'll bring our time together to a close. So thank you in advance here for your comments. Any folks or individuals who would like to share a verbal comment? Go ahead and unmute yourself. I'll just pause for just a few seconds here. So let me share my screen here. And again, thinking for information ahead, what would be most helpful? How can we bring today's events to a close here and be able to capture the thinking of all of you as you've contributed so positively already to today's events? So what I would like to invite you to do is to think to yourself, for you, number one, what were the highlights for you for you personally? Number two, how are you feeling about today's activities and conversations? Number three, what difference did today's participation mean for you personally? And number four, what are some of the next steps for us to consider? And for us, meaning your team. And I guess I also want to defer to the team here, Anne and all those, Jennifer, certainly Mary Therese and others who are part of the leadership team as a part of not just today's events, but other opportunities and activities. So anyway, let's look at the first one there. So what are some of the highlights for you during the day? Again, want you to feel free to respond in the chat box. You can do that, or you can speak openly with the platform here. So take a moment and think about that first question, if you would. Thank you.
For me, the timeliness and practicality of it all.
I really appreciated all of the group interactions, such diversity throughout the day in group size and in meeting a great perspective of views on deepening this experience.
Thank you, Joy.
To respond, and then not to feel bad if you didn't respond, but there are other ways to make a difference.
Thank you. Yes.
I thought that the sessions were very confidence building, and it helped me to know that my concerns are common to many other people too.
Yes. Thank you. And that's such an important point.
I'll see if this sticks. Sorry, I've been having problems technologically all day.
Thank you, Anne. We hear you very, albeit shaky, but yes, thank you for joining us when you can today. So I would now, if you would, with number two, think of think of a feeling word or words. How are you feeling about today's activities and conversations? If you were to put a feeling word to that, go ahead and put that in the chat box. What feelings
today's activities bring to you. Thank you. Invested, empowered, enriched, hopeful. It's also common to feel a little overwhelmed. I know when especially when we read reports like the ACEs reports, and we understand and we know the prevalence and just the need that's out there. You know better than anybody the need in our communities. And going back to your words for leadership of service, absolutely makes perfect sense. So thank you for sharing those words. Inspired, Donna writes. Question number 3 is an interpretive question. It's asking for you personally, a difference or a perspective, or hearing some from others. I've heard just anecdotally some of your comments earlier today, kind of processing out loud. So number 3 is asking to interpret, like, well, so what difference did today's participation mean for you and for you personally, before we get into the last question, but for you personally, what difference did today's make? So go ahead and respond. Love, Janet, thank you. Knowledge is power. Yeah, absolutely. Lorraine, be more aware of my comments, more self-aware. Thank you. Such a really great point to make. Energized, Jean, Mary. Growing awareness. Thank you, Sister Pat. Yes, thank you. Gathering and learning from others. To me, I find energizing. I find it hopeful and encouraging. All those examples. The difference it makes for me is knowing that every time we convene events like this, I feel like we're continuing to build and grow capacity, mutual understanding. We still have our unique differences, but we all have more, maybe kind of being able to visualize that common goal towards prevention, nonviolence, etc. Again, things that are a part of what, it's a part of the Sisters of the Presentation brand and approach, and it's part of your how you live out your commitment to yourselves, your community, to each other. So thank you for that. Last but not least, this is really going to be helpful for the team moving forward, and that is when you think about next steps for us, the Sisters of the Presentation, to consider. So thinking about your past experiences, some of the past conversations, thinking ahead, there's all ideas, putting all options on the table, if you will. So go ahead and take a moment just to share in the chat box, or if you want to share out loud. This is being recorded as well, so your comments will work either way, either in text or verbally. Take just a couple more minutes and go ahead and finish your thoughts in the chat. Thank you for jotting those down. It's very helpful. So as a way to kind of bring my piece to a close, it's actually an invitation to not be afraid to email or call, connect with me or any of the colleagues with whom I work around this model. For some of you, you might be working with other audiences. Maybe you work with a youth group. Maybe you might work with a group of adults who are, have a similar characteristic and are meeting for a variety of reasons. And sometimes it's helpful to, if you wanted to create an opportunity to really kind of build this capacity about all of our collective responsibilities in terms of prevention and awareness and leadership, that we have over the years developed and created several different scenarios, fairly unique to different audiences, but with a lot of relevance. And a lot of utility in how it's used. So
please, through the connections with Anne or with Jennifer, please feel free to reach out or connect. If I can help provide any other resources, I sure would be willing to do that. Just would need to know what might be helpful. You have some resources today to use. I would encourage you to check out the Bystander, What Difference a Bystander Makes article, which I wasn't able to coordinate like I wanted to this morning, but that is a really good article. And what I like about it is it speaks to some of the concerns and needs in our rural parts of the state, in rural America, which would be, I would believe, would be similar to rural Ireland in terms of feeling that sense of isolation, resources, questions around that. So anyway, check out that article as well. And I think we're able to send that to you. So check out the resources in that shared file down the road. But please let me know how this can be, how I can be helpful to help you do your work and strengthen your leadership and the presentation's footprint on the world, so to speak. So with that, I'm going to invite Sister Jennifer, or I don't think Ann was able to connect with us here, but anyway.
Thank you. Good. First of all, I would like to thank all of you as participants today from around the world. This is a wonderful gathering, and the presentation enterprise continues. So thank you so much. It's been a long day, but it's been a full day, and I know we have much to process in our own lives. I'd like to thank Mary Therese and Jesse for being our electronic wizards today. You were very helpful. You impress me every time you do that. It's wonderful. And Alan, I'd like to thank you for inspiring us, for empowering us, and helping us to remember that indeed the answers lie within us, the wisdom lies within us, and the power lies within us. We have so much to unfold and release. And I have a feeling that there might be an Emmy nomination coming from the presentation enterprise for your presentation today. So don't be surprised if another Emmy nomination appears in your life, but thank you so much. I would invite us to close by those of you who are participating here, just raising your hand, and we'll bless Alan in our departure today. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord let his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look upon you kindly and give you peace. So blessings to all of you. Oh, another thank you to the Nonviolent Promise group too. That was a force that surfaced. So Alan, again, thank you. Blessings on your wonderful ministry. You are doing such important work in our world today, and we need people like you to guide us. So thanks to everyone, and have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.